Hello, fellow sapiens. Dim the lights, loosen the jaw. Let your breath match the sea. Slow in, slower out. This is slow, factual storytelling for sleepy yet curious minds, where we unspool long arcs with care and calm. If this keeps you company on a drive, in the kitchen, or before sleep, tell me, how and when do you listen? Timestamps are in the description so you can hop to your favorite parts. Now, let's begin. Why now? In the last decade, ancient biomolecules and harbor geoarchaeology have transformed the Indian Ocean story. Plant and animal aDNA trace journeys we only guessed at. Lipid residues whisper recipes from broken pots. Port sediment cores preserve spice biomarkers and ship wood fragments in quiet layers. New isotopes and careful readings of inscriptions sketch lives otherwise missing. Before dawn on the Malabar coast, a quiet channel threads through palms and low mist. A team stands on a floating platform, the kind you can disassemble and carry. A headlamp halo catches moths. The water looks black, but it's only the sky poured into it. They lower a corer, a slim tube with teeth at one end, into the silt where a harbor once breathed. The rope glides through wet hands. The tube bites. Someone calls time. The lift is slow, deliberate, the way you'd bring up a story you don't want to spill. A cylinder of earth rises into the light. Bands appear, dark, then pale, then dark again, like tree rings without wood. A kingfisher clicks somewhere behind you. Nearby, a shard of imported amphora peeks from a cut bank, its red fabric rough with small white inclusions. On the platform, they split the core. The smell is faint but layered. River leaf, old smoke, a ghost of tar. The first centimeter is modern. The next few show pollen from rice and coconut. Deeper down, there's a thin horizon flecked with charcoal and shell. A storm or a dredge, hard to say yet. A chemist marks bags for later, lipids and biomarkers. Tiny samples will go to a lab where solvent will coax out molecules with names like eugenol, cinnamaldehyde, and long-chain waxes. In one sample, months from today, they'll find a trace that matches clove. Not a whole bud, not a legend. A compound signature at parts per billion, sitting in a quiet layer a meter below your shoes. Far to the west, a different morning opens over the Swahili coast. Stone houses line a narrow street, plaster flaking like bark. A fish market wakes. Someone grinds a paste, coconut and tamarind, chili and something else. Maybe a pinch of cardamom that came long ago with sailors who rode the same winds that once left this very harbor. Above the roofs, the wind is already turning. In June and July, it will steady from the southwest, the smell of ocean plated with rain. Months later, it will reverse, a long exhale from the northeast. This is not weather, it's schedule. Now think of a dhow riding those lines of pressure like rails. No oars slap the water. The sail is laced palm and cotton, patched and trusted. Knowledge sits in wrists and eyes. When to leave, how far to hug the coast, which star to check when cloud is thin, where the currents try to trick you near Socotra, and how to read the sky over Lanka by the color of dawn. There's ginger in the cargo. There are black peppercorns in a jar, some traded for ivory bracelets, some for rice. A rooster complains from a wicker pen, a stowaway data point for a scientist not yet born. We tend to tell these stories as empire dramas or treasure hunts, but what if we turn the camera? What if the protagonist is a wind that turns on time? What if the technology is not a bronze ram for an oared galley, but a lateen sail trimmed to a seasonal logic? Sail, not oar, rhythm, not brute force. Across 2.5 millennia, those rhythms rearranged diets. Bananas in Africa, coconuts in new belts, spices and sugars tucked into cuisines far from their home groves. They also carried beliefs, Buddhist relics in ports of Gujarat, Sufi lineages along the Swahili coast, Hindu traders building shrines in Sumatra, and later Muslim jurists penning maritime contracts in Calicut and Aden. Our question is quiet and exact. How did knowledge of seasonal winds structure the movement of food and faith around the Indian Ocean rim between 1000 BCE and 1400 CE? And how do we know? Some answers dwell in texts, Hippalus notes, travelers' tales, Sanskrit and Arabic inscriptions. Many answers now come from things too small to see: DNA in charred seeds, lipids in amphora pores, isotopes in human and animal teeth, seafloor, and harbor cores that keep time in mud. Each carries not just a where and a when, but a how, a traceable route, a dietary shift, a port that grew busy and then quiet. Picture for a moment a single black peppercorn. In a museum drawer in Cairo, there is one like it that once lay in the folds of a royal wrapping. Whether that specific story holds for a given reign is still debated by specialists. What is clear is that South Asian pepper reaches Egypt early, and by the first millennium CE, pepper is a habit in Roman kitchens and Coptic recipes. The pepper's path is mapped not by a single hero voyage, but by repeated crossings bound to the monsoon timetable, by Kintrax and kin, by credit and weather. Or consider a banana leaf in morning light in the Great Lakes region. The varieties there were not born in Africa. Their ancestors came from island Southeast Asia by steps and stops, before and during the first millennium CE. Ancient DNA and linguistic echoes point to those paths. The winds gave windows to cross. People stitched those windows into calendars, into work, into taste. We will linger with the objects and the winds. We will be honest where the trail goes thin. Who rowed and who steered and who cooked on board. Texts skew toward elites. Burials at ports are mixed, their contexts broken by later building. We will mark those limits and show what kinds of data could change the picture. Strontium and oxygen isotopes in teeth, from port cemeteries, careful epigraphy tying names to places, genomes of commensals that trace stowaway lineages across water. For now, it is still pre-dawn on the platform. A breeze ruffles the palm crowns. Someone caps the core and writes a date. The monsoon is a machine that runs on patience. So is the lab. In the next part, we'll meet the winds themselves as an ancient technology, what they do, when they turn, and how sailors learned their clock. Step outside, just in imagination, to a terrace above a quiet harbor and feel the air, because the air itself is the machine in this story, switching direction on a schedule older than the stone of the quay beneath our feet. The seasonal winds of the Indian Ocean have names that fit in the mouth, like prayers. Kaskazi and Kusi along the Swahili coast, the northeast and southwest monsoon farther east, and each name is also a timer, a calendar, a promise that if a sail is raised on the right week, a hull will move where it intends to go. Mariners learn those names the same way they learn their own, through repetition, through elders, through the long patience of waiting seasons out in strange ports with familiar skies. When land heats in summer, air rises and draws in the ocean's breath. Months later, as land cools, the flow reverses, and the same coast knows the opposite breeze. Those reversals are not gentle suggestions, but structural rails, and the ocean organizes around them. Currents turn, belts of rain slide, and the low-level jet that skims along the horn quickens the sea into chop that a practiced hand can read by eye. On a map, this looks simple, arrows one way, arrows back. But on the water, it becomes a choreography sailors anticipate with the intimacy of gardeners awaiting the first monsoon shower on parched Zhou. The winds are an engine, yes, but a clock first. Sail, not oar, is the technology that lets human bodies fit to this clock without breaking themselves against it. An oared galley forces motion through labor. A sailing hull makes a conversation with pressure and angle. The lateen sail, a long, slanting triangle, allows a boat to keep some headway, even when the wind is not straight behind. A gift in harbors and when hugging coasts. The sewn plank tradition that bound strakes with cord rather than iron nails added a springiness to hulls that mattered in lumpy seas, a kind of living joint. On a quiet beach in Oman, or on India's Malabar coast, a visitor might have seen, even 2,000 years ago, palms turned to cordage, stitched into a shape that knew how to flex under load and forgive error better than a rigid frame could. Flexibility in wood and flexibility in schedule together formed a risk calculus mariners trusted. The wind split the year into sailing windows, and those windows shaped lives. A trader leaving Calicut for Aden rode the northeast monsoon after harvest, then waited months on the far side for the southwest winds to grant a return, wintering in neighborhoods that became mini archipelagos of language and taste. Shops salted with familiar pickles, a shrine in a borrowed style, cooking fires tuned to a spice brought in cargo. The social fact of this waiting built families across water and made contracts longer than a single crossing. Those months of stasis were not idle. They were when trust was renewed, marriages arranged, debts reconciled, and small recipes exchanged, changing palates along with balance sheets. Knowledge of the winds was granular, not just seasonal. A pilot knew that along Socotra, the sea could steepen under a fast, low-level flow, and that near the mouths of the Indus silt bars, shift after floods and storms, demanding a lighter draft or a lead line shaded by experience. In the Bay of Bengal, the intermonsoon periods brought squalls that could rip a careless sail, and the long fetch from the south sent swells that bent around headlands, complicating approaches even under gentle breezes. Currents mattered as much as air. The Somali current reverses with the seasons. The equatorial counterflow cuts across like a subterranean river. And in the Laccadive Sea, eddies could make a fast passage faster or turn an error into a drift that lost days. To those who worked the water, these were not abstractions. They were slices of time and space that could be counted on. There were books, lists of headlands and bearings, notes on reefs, clue lists of stars to check when cloud thinned enough. Long before the age of printed atlases. A first-century manual out of the Red Sea describes harbors, monsoon onset, and what to look for when a coast rises from the haze. Centuries later, pilots from different littorals kept their own compilations, extending a tradition that was partly written, partly oral, and entirely scaffolded by the winds. Star paths gave latitude when cloud cleared, while coastal pilots relied on land-sky seams, the color of water over shoals, and the company of birds at dawn and dusk to fix position without numbers. A small wooden board and a knotted cord could steady a course by the height of Polaris. A night's worth of cloud meant hugging the swell and trusting a known current to carry a vessel where the next morning's landfall would make sense again. To call the monsoon a technology is to respect human choice within a constraint. The winds do not compel, they enable. People decided to plant groves and mills and markets on that enabling rhythm. They planted coconut where it would root and drink salt-washed air, and they carried saplings and suckers for banana along routes that fit a sail plan, shading them on deck and watering them sparingly so that at a far shore they could take and spread. Spices, light and dear, rode in small packages, less vulnerable to spoilage. Heavier goods like rice or pottery needed careful timing and more robust hulls. Guilds and families learned what to load when, and the seasonal schedule turned logistics into tradition. Send durable, dry cargo late in the season. Hold the fragile for the fair weeks, or for coasting legs that can duck into shelter when the sky turns. This is also a story about risk, measured in days and in taste. A pilot who left too early could meet headwinds that forced tacking until provisions thinned. Too late, and the first long swells of the opposing season would make harbors treacherous. Storms are not the shape of most days, but when they come, they reframe the year. Even then, the wind's regularity trained a culture of patience rather than panic. In a stone house near a port gate, a family made preserves and dried fish for the wait. In a mosque or temple or shrine, sailors pledged offerings for a safe crossing, fixed to a week still weeks away. A calm society forms around a predictable engine. Consensus among scholars is uncontroversial on these mechanics. The monsoon's predictability underwrote an ocean-wide bidirectional network, in which seasonal schedules and wine knowledges acted as infrastructure, as important as harbors and hulls. Some minority debates explore how often mariners crossed entire basins in one go in earlier centuries, versus chaining shorter legs along the coast. Cabotage that never strayed too far from land, arguing over the balance between daring passages and prudent segmentation. The evidence suggests both existed, with the proportions shifting by route, ship type, and era, and with longer open water leaps favored on lanes where currents and wind set up cooperative corridors during peak weeks. If there is a single gesture that captures sail as technology here, it is this: a hand at a sheet easing a canvas as a gust climbs, then trimming again to keep the bow true. All else follows: contracts, cuisines, small gods in the corners of houses far from their first altars, and the spread of plants whose genomes still carry the memory of their carried journeys. The winds made time legible to more than farmers. They made the sea legible to those who would make a living from it. And in that legibility, a world cohered without a single empire to command it, only calendars to synchronize it. Tonight's cadence asks for honesty about limits, and one stands out already. The winds defined schedules, but who stood on deck, who slept in the forecastle, who cooked aboard, and whose hands hoisted and mended? The social makeup of crews across centuries and coasts remains patchy in the record, overrepresented by elite voices and underpinned by burials in ports that have been disturbed by later building. We will return to this with care, because the winds shape a world, but people inhabit its details, and this series belongs to both. In the next part, we'll unfurl a map seafloor interlude, laying paleo shorelines beside modern charts and stepping through harbor cores and bathymetry to see where ports grew, silted, shifted, and sank. Close the eyes and let a map form slowly from darkness. First, the shape of the Indian Ocean, wide shoulders between Africa and Australia, a tapering neck toward the Red Sea and Persian Gulf, an eastern reach into the Java and South China Seas. Now add a dim blue grid under the water, bathymetry, the seabed's quiet relief. Ridges lift, shelves spread, canyons cut river wounds across the continental margin. The lights of ancient ports glow faint along the coasts, then flicker and shift across centuries as shorelines move, rivers wander, and harbors breathe silt. Sea level, after the last ice age, rose to a high stand and then settled into smaller undulations. Rivers responded the way rivers do, building deltas, jumping channels, abandoning old mouths and carving new ones. Ports that began on open water sometimes found themselves inland on backwaters. Others were swallowed by the sea after storms shaved dunes or tectonics tilted a coast. If the monsoon is the ocean's clock, then this is its memory. Sand, silt, clay, and shell laid down in bands that a corer can read like a tide-fixed diary. Picture the Red Sea first, long and narrow. Stone roads once linked inland valleys to the Red Sea shore, dumping caravan loads into harbors that live by the rhythm of the northeast and southwest winds. The seabed here drops quickly. Anchorages were small, tucked behind reefs and headlands. Under modern water lie scatterings of amphorae fragments and ship timbers, a mosaic too fine to see without side-scan sonar and divers' lamps. Sub-bottom profilers pulse through sand to catch the echoes of buried channels and old quay faces. In those echoes, archaeologists reconstruct harbors that expanded and contracted, sometimes from human choice, sometimes from silt pushed by seasonal currents and the occasional flood that turned braided wadis into brown ropes of energy. Slide the map south, trace the Horn, and follow the Swahili coast. The continental shelf is narrow, reefs guard lagoons, tides run strong through passes. City islands and peninsulas sprouted stone towns, door lintels carved with geometric patience, coral rag cut into blocks, mosques that align shade with breeze. In some places, cores near old landing places show shifts in grain size, where dredging or storm scours opened and then healed channels. In others, mangrove pollen spikes in the layers tell of estuaries expanding, then retreating as sediment built up, pushing boats farther out to load and unload. The longshore drift here is steady, sand walking north or south depending on season, quietly editing beaches. A port that thrived for a century might find its outer bar thickening, its inlet tight. A generation later, a new opening forms a few bends away, and the marketplace follows it, as if the town itself accepted that harbors are living beings. Now cross to the Indian subcontinent. West coast first, a ragged necklace of inlets and backwaters, monsoon-fed rivers turning the Arabian Sea brown for weeks each year. Some ancient entrepôts sat where fresh water met tide, catching cargo from the hinterland and handing it to the ocean. Over centuries, river mouths shifted. A harbor that faced open water silted into a quiet creek. A quiet creek was cut by a flood into a fresh-cut approach, briefly deep and inviting. Harbor cores here show alternating layers. Fine clays from quiet monsoon rains, coarser sands from storm pulses, charcoal flecks from riverside burning, a sprinkle of shell where brackish lagoons expanded. Mixed into those is a human signal, fish bones and charred plant bits that spike during phases of intense port use, then thin when trade slowed or shifted upriver or down. On the east coast of India, river deltas write bolder letters. The Bay of Bengal's swell, the strong river loads, and cyclones that rearrange mouths in a night have combined to make old port stories travel inland and offshore at once. Some ancient towns now lie beneath fields far from the current beach line, their pottery and brick walls showing where a shoreline used to be. Others lie beneath the surf, where sonar can map buried walls and streets, corridors of stone and water-lensed light. Sand covers, sand reveals. The work is patient, tide-limited, season-limited. The bathymetric lines here are gentle, a wide shelf that invites the sea to wander across it in storms and calmer ages alike. Step across to Sri Lanka, an island set like a drop lens on the trade lanes. Harbors on its north and west once watched seasonal sails approach and recede like migrating birds. Seafloor maps around these sites show drowned ridges and sand waves marching under persistent currents. Quarries near the old basins hold layers that thicken exactly where one would expect a port's busy phase to leave its signature. More charcoal from kilns and kitchens, more imported micro-remains, and even glassy micro-slivers from broken vessels ground to dust. When the monsoon was generous and routes were busy, the mud kept count. Farther east, narrow straits concentrated movement. The Strait of Malacca acts like a river between seas, funneling ships, ideas, and sometimes silt. Bathymetry there shows deep troughs and shoals that shift under strong tidal streams. Pilots watched the color changes, threw leads, and learned local eddies like neighbors. Under the modern shipping noise lie older anchors and the iron shadows of bolts from vessels that once carried spices outward and ceramics back. Each hull part of the heartbeat of an ocean whose arteries narrow just here. These maps and cores are not just scenery, scenery, they are method. Side-scan sonar paints the seabed in grayscale, letting eyes catch the unnatural right angles of walls or the shadows of timbers lying proud under sand. Multi-beam bathymetry builds color-shaded relief where a silted channel branches, showing how a port's logic changed as access deepened or shallowed. Sub-bottom profiling sends sound into the first meters of sediment and listens for returns that flag buried layers. Old harbor floors, quay faces rebedded by floods, dredge scars healed to smoothness. Then the corer takes literal samples of time. A narrow tube slides into mud and returns with a stack of stories. Each centimeter a season or a year or a cluster of years, depending on the setting. In those layers, microfossils of foraminifera tell salinity and depth stories. Pollen records plant communities around the port. Charcoal marks human fire. And, with solvent and care, molecules come out. Waxes from plants, biomarkers of spices unwritten in any account book, tar residues that speak of hull maintenance and pitch recipes. There are places where debate stays lively, and the map reminds us to be careful. Identifying a specific ancient name with a modern ruin can feel satisfying, but remains provisional when rivers have a habit of moving and communities reuse stone for centuries. One site's amphorae and pepper seeds are persuasive. Another's submerged wall lines look convincing until a storm recuts the beach and the pattern dissolves. Consensus builds from convergences, geomorphology that fits the harbor story, artifacts that match the expected trade, texts that mention a river bend or a sequence of days' sail, and cores that show human-thickened layers at the right centuries. Where one line of evidence leans but does not lock, another can steady the hand. Ethical note: the sea keeps secrets, but coasts keep graves and shrines. Many port mounds and drowned edges are attached to living memory and sacred practice. Excavation and coring, even when minimally invasive, must follow community consent and legal frameworks, and destructive sampling for laboratory analysis should be minimized and justified. When the work touches burial grounds or long-venerated ruins, the baseline is respect, paired with shared stewardship of finds, data, and the meanings they carry. As the imagined map drifts away, leave a last overlay in place, the monsoon arrows switching direction across the basin. Harbor siltation pulses on that schedule. Bar formation thickens on that schedule. The season to dredge, to mend, to wait is set by that schedule. The undersea ridges and the drowned ledges do not move quickly, but the ports tied to them do, sliding a little each generation to meet a new channel, a new mouth, a new bar. Sailors learned where the seabed's stubbornness met the wind's patience, and in that meeting point they placed tones, markets, kitchens, and lives. In the next part, we'll hold an iconic object in the mind's hand, a single peppercorn, and follow its chain of evidence through texts, residue, and context to see how a tiny berry became a clock hand for this ocean. Cup the palm in the mind's lantern and place a single peppercorn there, small, wrinkled, matty black, no larger than a lentil, yet dense with heat and history. Roll it with thumb and forefinger and feel, in that grit, a hillside far away where vines climbed living poles, shade trees in the rain-washed western Ghats, green drupes blushing to red before harvest, then spread to dry into these dark beads that pinch the tongue awake. A peppercorn is both seed and schedule, a spice that ripens with the rains and leaves home only when the wind agrees, slipping into sacks just as sails are bent on the yards. Follow this one peppercorn back to its beginning. The vine that bore it liked humidity and filtered light, a lattice of bark and air that turned monsoon downpours into a steady sip. Farmers learned to prune and train it, to time the pick just shy of full ripeness for best drying, to blanch briefly or not at all depending on the flavor and the market. In low barns and verandas, pepper spread on mats, first a green scatter, then an olive, then a deepening black as sun, and time wrinkled and sealed each fruit. Children's hands helped, elders checked for mold, the scent sharpened as water left. In busy seasons, pepper shared space with other goods, ginger slices, turmeric fingers, areca nuts, the hum of conversation about prices and winds. The harvest was not just agricultural, it was logistical, keyed to departure windows. A farmer who missed the last fair week of the northeast monsoon might hold stock until the next cycle, hedging by selling some inland and keeping some for the long voyage market. From the hills, pepper traveled down to backwaters and ports by riverboat and bullock cart, packed in coir and leaf, tucked into jars, counted and weighed in measures that knit together trust. A town by a river mouth smelled of wet rope, rice husk dust, drying fish, and, faintly, that specific electricity of pepper, the way it seems to tighten the back of the throat even before it's tasted. On the quay, a tallyman stylist scratched a line for each sack. An agent set aside a portion to pay debts. Another portion went into a clinker-built craft that would ferry it out to the deep-keeled hulls anchored beyond the bar. There, the pepper met the season's physics. If the wind had swung to its winter source, the great sail would pull the cargo west, toward Arabia and the Red Sea. If not, it would wait with other cargoes, coconuts, cotton, tin-bright jars, for the first whispers that meant it was time. Imagine now a deck on a morning you could actually breathe. The air is cool, the water is still, but a low line on the horizon promises motion. A rooster mutters in a basket, someone sharpens a knife on a whetstone, a pot hisses as breakfast bubbles. Pepper sits below in jars and sacks, light enough to value, heavy enough to care about stowage. The captain holds a cord marked in knots and a small wooden board. A pilot checks the color seam where sky meets water, reading haze and the first cat's paw ruffles. When the breeze fills, the yard pivots, canvas heaves, and the black beads begin their measured departure from home, each one a punctum on a ledger of taste that stretches for months and miles. Pepper's chain of evidence is as material as it is textual. Broken jars near quays carry faint residues. Grinders in kitchens thousands of miles away kept starch ghosts caught between scratches. Middens preserved charred berries that escaped cooking and fell into ash. Seeds embedded in ship bilges slipped into anaerobic safety. In storehouses, numbers on palm leaf or papyrus recorded loans against cargo lists that mention pepper explicitly, tiny contracts that now anchor big maps. Each scrap, seen alone, is a whisper. Together, they become a hum one can chart. Origins in the wet hills, consolidation in riverine ports, bulk movement along monsoon routes, dispersal into kitchens and rituals far from the vine. The peppercorn in the hand also touches a gallery of rooms. In a townhouse along the Nile, a cook pinched a few grains into a mortar with salt and herbs. The rhythm of the pestle turned them into a paste that met oil and something sour, fermented fish or wine vinegar, before dressing a plate for a midday meal. In an island monastery off the western coast of India, someone added a few peppercorns to a pot of lentils, the sting softened by coconut milk. On an island in the Swahili littoral, a feast day stew gleamed with coconut and pepper heat, brightened by tamarind. Pepper is both a luxury and a habit, dear when counted in sacks, ordinary when pinched between fingers into food meant to comfort and gather. It is tempting to tell Pepper's story as a single dramatic crossing, one heroic voyage stitching India to the Mediterranean, but the monsoon erases that drama and replaces it with rhythm. Pepper moved because crews and families trusted schedules. Harvest here when the rains taper, ship then, wait, return, repeat. The predictability diluted risk enough that high-value, low-bulk goods could move steadily, and over time that steadiness changed taste. A city that gets pepper once is thrilled. A city that gets pepper every year begins to plan menus around it, begins to teach children that a certain soup should prickle, that a certain pickle should bite. The monsoon made transit possible, but people made meaning. Pepper signaled status in some settings and comfort in others. It entered medicine chests as much as kitchens, prescribed for cold humors or sluggish digestion. Its heat coated as balancing a body that had tilted off center. Traders learned to grade lots by look and scent. Householders learned to keep it dry. Cooks learned when to add it, to the pot for a round heat, to the plate for a bright spark. In stories, pepper became the sort of commodity that could be mentioned as shorthand for long-distance trade, a synecdoche for the ocean's connective tissue. Now, step toward the lab bench without losing the quiet. If a small sherd comes in from a riverside storehouse or a harbor dump, a conservator may lift a few grains of residue from its inner wall, dissolve them in solvent, and pass the extract through a machine that separates molecules by weight and time. Among the peaks, a familiar signature rises, the alkaloid that gives pepper its bite. Under a microscope, a thin smear from a mortar might reveal starch granules with a shape and hilum distinctive to pepper, scorched into greater recognizability by the cooking that fixed them. In a midden layer dated by associated charcoal and ceramics, the presence of pepper seeds offers a tight bracket for when and where someone used it, aligning with the monsoon sensible roots that must have brought it there. If a crumpled contract lists sacks and values linked to a specific port name, the paper joins the pot and the seed in a chorus. Because this is a gentle channel and not a breathless one, a small caution belongs here. Pepper stories have sometimes leaned on singular dramatic finds in elite contexts. Those are striking, but not sufficient on their own. The stronger picture comes from convergence, hill agriculture, and harvest teaming that fit the monsoon, coastal assemblages that swell with pepper remains during known trade peaks, textual notes that match routes and seasons, and residues where chemistry ties line to line. Where a claim rests on one dazzling find, the tone should be curiosity, not certainty. Where many small finds point the same way, the tone can settle. There is also an ethical line that runs through these seeds. Some contexts that could answer questions, funerary textiles, sacred storerooms, venerated ruins near old ports, are not just archives but living heritage. Sampling should be sparing, destructive analysis justified and agreed upon with custodians, and publication mindful of community meaning. Pepper may be global, but its traces belong first to the places and people who kept them safe, often without knowing they were doing so. Hold the peppercorn again, feel its lightness, and then let it go. It tumbles back into the sack, into the hold, into a kitchen that smells of onion and oil. If the monsoon is a clock, pepper is one of its hands, a small pointer moving reliably enough that entire cuisines come to trust it. The bead in the palm is proof that a wind learned long ago became a habit that belongs to breakfast, to supper, to celebration, and to the soft ordinary of taste. In the next part, we'll step into methods and evidence I, a calm walk through how we know what we know, from ancient DNA and lipid biomarkers to harbor cores and inscriptions, and how those lines of data braid into routes. Step with care into a cool room where the air hums softly and gloves whisper against paper, glass, and clay. This is where the monsoon story is translated from mud and shard, bone and seed into timelines and routes, not by grand declarations, but by many small measurements in chorus. Begin with ancient DNA, the threads of code that survive in the most unlikely places when chance and chemistry are kind. In a charred seed the size of a fingernail moon, fragments of plant DNA persist like singed lace. In the tartar of a human tooth, a chalky ridge built by years of meals, plant and animal molecules become trapped, a pantry sealed and carried to the grave. Technicians take only what is needed, often no more than the sweepings from a tiny drill pass, then move the powder into a clean room where air is filtered, suits are zipped, and every gesture is a spell against contamination. Short fragments are expected, ancient DNA breaks with time, and bears a distinctive pattern of damage at its ends that confirms age. By targeting regions that distinguish, say, a Southeast Asian banana lineage from an African one, or a clove from other aromatic plants, the lab can map ancestry onto geography, and geography onto routes that make sense only if boats rode seasonal winds. Animals tell their own versions of the crossing. The mitochondrial signatures of commensal species, black rats, chickens, carry the memories of stowaway lineages, their maternal lines mapping paths they never chose but traveled nonetheless. A femur from a port midden, a tiny toe bone from a storage pit, a feather sheath embedded in ship tar, each can yield a haplogroup whose closest relatives live far away. When those relatives cluster along a lane that a monsoon makes seasonally easy, a map sharpens. Combine this with isotopes from tooth enamel, strontium tracing bedrock, oxygen echoing water sources, and an animal's birthplace and its later diet begin to separate on a graph, a before and after that hints at movement across regions where geology and rainfall differ. Turn to pots and the memories they absorb. Clay vessels, fired in small kilns and put to work in kitchens and holds, are porous enough to drink a little of what they carry. Centuries later, a sherd's inner wall still harbors lipids, long-chain molecules from oils and waxes, resins and spices, locked in microscopic pores. A clean scalpel lifts scrapings into vials. Solvents coax out the fats, and a gas chromatograph coupled to a mass spectrometer separates and weighs the molecules as they pass, each compound peaking at a known moment, each mass fragmenting in a signature way. The result is a skyline of peaks where certain spices announce themselves, quietly but clearly. The phenolic breath of clove, the aldehydic warmth of cinnamon, the stubborn stability of plant waxes from coconut. When those signatures occur repeatedly in layers securely dated to a port's busy centuries, they shift spice lore towards spice evidence, and they anchor cuisines to places and times rather than to legend. Residues do not speak only of ingredients, they also tell of technique. Heating reshapes molecules, frying, boiling, and roasting all leave different fingerprints in the ratios of degraded fats and the presence of certain byproducts. So, a sherd can say, wordlessly, "This was a stew, not a stored oil. This was a spice paste warmed in fat. This was a vessel that held something aromatic and dry." Marry those chemical murmurs to the shapes of pots, wide-mouthed for stirring, narrow-necked for storage. And daily life returns, not in a rush, but steadily enough to see habits form and travel along with cargo. Harbor cores are the timekeepers, the mud diaries. A slender tube pushed into a silted basin comes back striped with seasons and storms, each layer a note in a long, quiet song. Grain-size shifts mark calmer years and sudden floods. Charcoal flecks rise when ports are busy, and people cook, kiln, and mend. Pollen tells of the trees planted around the harbor and in hinterlands that drain to it, expanding coconut groves, rice fields breathing in and out with cultivation, mangroves marching as shorelines adjust. Some layers carry molecular traces, fecal sterols that betray population density, tar residues from pitched hulls, faint signatures of traded aromatics settling out of air or washing off decks. Dates come from many anchors, short-lived charcoal calibrated carefully, marine shells corrected for reservoir effects, pottery styles with tight ranges cross-checked against absolute measures. Bayesian models then knit these threads into a coherent timeline, assigning probabilities to when exactly a port thickened with human signal and when it thinned, its channels silting or its traffic shifting down coast. Text and stone add names to maps that science alone would keep nameless. Inscriptions on temple lintels and mosque plaques, in Brahmi, Tamil Brahmi, Arabic, and Persian scripts, record donations by merchants, guilds, and shipmasters, sometimes naming home ports, goods, and seasons. A copper plate grants tax relief to spice traders. A traveler's account notes the month winds turn and what a market smells like. A shipping contract sets interest rates pegged to the monsoon calendar, because time itself is collateral. Epigraphy supplies the who and the why in places where mud, seed, and pot supply the what and the when. When an inscription at a coastal shrine mentions a guild from a distant city and a harbor core below, that shrine swells with human-thickened layers at the same centuries. A confidence grows that the same network speaks in two languages, one molecular, one carved. Archaeobotany fills baskets with smaller certainties. Phytoliths, silica skeletons that plants build in their tissues, survive where pollen does not, their shapes distinctive enough to flag banana, rice, and coconut even in tough settings. Starch granules, once embedded in grinding stones and mortars, carry hilum and lamella patterns that identify their parent plants. Heat alters those shapes in predictable ways, so cooked and raw can sometimes be told apart. When these micro-remains appear in port layers that coincide with shifts in diet inferred from human bone isotopes, carbon and nitrogen ratios moving with increased marine intake, or C3 versus C4 plant reliance, the picture turns from still to moving. People are not just present, they are eating differently, and that difference aligns with the arrival of new foods. Consensus and caution walk together here. It is widely accepted that monsoon-timed sailing redistributed cultigens and commensals around the rim, and that this movement is now trackable with ADNA, lipids, harbor stratigraphy, and inscriptions in combination rather than isolation. The cautions are method-shaped. Ancient DNA can contaminate easily. Damage patterns and replication are non-negotiable checks. Lipid residues can be ambiguous. Compound identities rely on reference libraries and, when possible, compound-specific isotope signatures that add a second dimension of certainty. Harbor cores can smear time when burrowing organisms churn layers. Multiple cores and careful sedimentology help catch that. Inscriptions can travel from original settings to secondary use in later walls. Context is king, and so is stratigraphic honesty. An uncertainty box, placed gently, who sailed, who cooked, who mended, who kept accounts, the social makeup of crews and dockside labor, remains underspecified because texts skew elite, and because port burial grounds are often disturbed or ethically off-limits to excavation. What would help are non-destructive surveys to map cemeteries, minimally invasive sampling for isotopes to infer origins when communities consent, and a wider epigraphic net for humble marks, graffiti on pots, scratched names on stones, that speak in smaller voices. Until such lines thicken, crew life will be evoked more than described. Ethical note: many of these methods, especially ADNA and lipid extraction, are inherently destructive at tiny scales. Each sample, shard, seed, tooth, represents more than data. It is heritage held in trust. Work proceeds under permits and community agreements, with sampling minimized, documented, and, when possible, offset by open data and shared interpretation. Coastal sites often include sacred spaces and graves. Here, the right answer can be to step back, learn from the edges, and let some questions remain open until a respectful path appears. Set all this together and a braid appears, molecules, mud, and marks converging on routes that match the wind's calendar. The lab lights and the harbor mists are two rooms in the same house, and the door between them swings on a hinge of patience. Sail, not oar, is visible even here, in schedules inferred from signatures, in pauses recorded as layers, in the dependable cadence that allowed plants and ideas to cross and take root. In the next part, we'll trace living and stowaway lineages, banana trails and rat tails, following genomes and names across islands and coasts to watch how tastes and ecologies were rewired by seasonal crossings. Hold a leaf in the mind's hand, a banana leaf, broad as a door, with rain beads skating across its wax-dark green, and listen to the low thrum of insects waking along a riverbank at first light. Somewhere upstream, a canoe noses into a landing. In its belly rides suckers cut from a clump, wrapped in damp fiber and shaded against the sun. They look like little nothing-much bundles, but they are potential forests, and they carry with them the memory of another coast. When these are planted, a family will learn a new rhythm, the time from sucker to sword leaf, from sword to flag, from flag to fruit. The way the plant leans and throws offsets, the way a grove remakes soil and shade and taste. Bananas tell a story written in genomes and in cooking fires. Their wild ancestors grew in island Southeast Asia and New Guinea, where people learned to select for fewer seeds and more flesh, to rely on clonal propagation that turns one plant into a stand that can outlast a generation, to favor triploid varieties that eat sweet or starchy. Names traveled with them, words for fruit and grove and preparation, braided into Austronesian languages that themselves rode sails outward. Far from the first gardens, across straits and along coasts, bananas became plantains in markets where a chef's knife is as familiar as a mortar, and where a green fruit meets oil and salt, and becomes something that tastes like home, even when home is far behind. Along the Indian Ocean rim, the timing of this spread matters. In some places, bananas appear in the record as starch ghosts stuck in old grinding stones, and in the microscopic silica bodies, phytoliths, plants leave behind like tiny sculptures. The shapes are distinctive enough to tell banana from grass, a careful puzzle that analysts check twice. In other places, charred fragments of peel or stem catch in middens that held a village's past meals, and the carbon in those fragments carries a date that can be compared to the ages of associated pots and hearths. A cautious picture emerges. Arrivals in the first millennium CE in several African regions, likely by sea to some coasts and by river to others, with variation by route and climate. Some arguments point earlier. Others note the thinness of those lines and urge patience. What holds steady is the logic. A plant that loves humid heat, thrives in coastal belts and river valleys, and sits snugly within the sailing windows the monsoon grants. Linguistic echoes meet these fragments. Words for banana and plantain in coastal East Africa share kinship with terms from island Southeast Asia, hints of a time when people met in ports, traded recipes and spouses and stories, and left behind sounds that settled into local speech. These echoes do not date as cleanly as a charcoal fleck in a lab, but they help decide among roots when the map offers two plausible paths. When a word for a fruit aligns with a genetic lineage for that fruit, the confidence deepens. Both tongue and tissue point across the same water. Bananas did more than feed. They altered daily pace and field layout, joining coconut and taro and rice in mixed agroforestry where the goal is stability as much as yield. Groves at the edge of towns became places of cool and of small ceremony. Leaves, tough and generous, became plates and wraps. Fibers twisted into cord that smelled faintly green even after it dried. New dishes took shape in kitchens where elders remembered something like them from another island. And children learned that a savory stew wants a slice of plantain, fried golden, and sprinkled with salt. Now let the scene shift to a ship's deck. Late evening, a small basket squeaks. Inside, a rat blinks, whiskers a metronome. No one invited it. It came because ships are warm and full of food, and because wherever humans gather, maps widen for small mammals that follow. When archaeologists later sift a port's refuse, they find rat bones in sizes and shapes that say commensal, not wild. If a toe bone or a jaw gives up a trace of mitochondrial code, the line of mothers maps back to a place. Some haplogroups sketch arcs that begin in South Asia and curve toward the Swahili coast, matching lanes sailors favored under winter winds. Others whisper of later arrivals tied to different centuries. The animals did not plan any of this, but their bodies remember the plan that carried them. Chickens add a gentler clatter. Feathers, a leg tendon, a fragment of eggshell in the corner of a midden. These small pieces, when they hold DNA or the trace of a distinct protein, say origin in Southeast Asia and onward movement along the same routes that carried pepper and cloth. In some ports, chicken bones become common just when texts and ceramics say the harbor's network widened. In others, the layers are leaner, suggesting that taste and husbandry adopted at different tempos. Isotopes in chicken bones can even hint at where they grew. Grain from inland fields leaves one carbon signature, coastal fodder another. When a flock at a port shows mixed signals, it tells of birds bought from different hinterlands, the port acting as an ecological blender as well as a market. There is a tenderness in following these animals because they make clear that trade is not only high value and low bulk, not only spices and fine bowls. It is also life, messy and ordinary, moving in holds and cages, tethered to calendars and to care. A sailor feeds the birds and scolds the rats. A child in a port lane chases a loose hen, while an elder repairs a coop that looks the same in two languages. In these small acts, a regional ecology is rewired. New pests arrive with new foods. New predators find opportunity. Gardens adjust. Kitchens adjust. Stories adjust. Consensus holds that commensals are faithful witnesses to human movement. Their genomes travel the same roads and seas, and, because they breed quickly and die often, their lineages record change at a pace archaeology can read. Still, care is the rule. A single bone is a clue, not a verdict. Ancient DNA breaks and can be fooled by modern molecules. Analysts seek damage patterns and replicate results, tracing uncertainty with as much honesty as they trace routes. When two lines align, say, a rat haplogroup and a shift in trash layers that show imported ceramics, the picture strengthens. When three align, add a handful of banana phytoliths or a coconut lipid signal, the picture becomes sturdy enough to lean on. An ethical note belongs here. Some of the richest places to ask these questions are port cemeteries, where human teeth could yield isotopes that tell childhood origin and diet, or tartar that preserves the scratchings of meals long gone. But these are burial grounds, often still sacred, sometimes still visited by families who tie memory to stone. The right work in these places begins with consent and continues sometimes with restraint, non-invasive mapping, community-led questions, and a willingness to leave certain possibilities for later, or to turn instead to kitchen floors, hearth dumps, and harbor mud where answers can be found without touching the dead. Let a late afternoon settle over a river mouth. Farmers cut suckers and carry them to a new plot. A cook salts water and sets a pot to boil. A cat stretches along a sun-warmed wall while a rat considers a dash and thinks better of it. A small boy counts the days, by moon, by market, by monsoon, until uncles return with stories and new tastes. In the quiet logic of seasons, plants and animals learn to belong in new places, and the people who tend them learn to belong in new patterns of work and care. The monsoon gave the windows, the rest is patience, habit, and a willingness to adopt and adapt. In the next part, we'll step ashore into ports as kitchens, tasting how markets and homes along the rim folded new ingredients into daily meals, and how those flavors made neighborhoods feel like communities across water. Close the eyes and walk into a market at first light. Any century between 1000 BCE and 1400 CE, any port along the Indian Ocean's rim, the air is cool, shadows long, voices soft, and the smells are a gentle braid, tide thick fish, wood smoke, a green sweet note of coconut, the bright prickle of pepper and ginger, a sour tang from tamarind or fermented rice. Stalls wake in a sequence. A woman tips rice into a winnowing tray, and the grain hisses as husks lift. A man cracks a coconut, and the white flashes like new moon. A boy runs with a basket of limes, their oil folding into the air as he brushes past. This is commerce, yes. It is also a kitchen, scaled up and shared, where the monsoon schedule becomes menus and habits. Ports were not just warehouses. They were places people lingered because the winds required it. Waiting seasons made neighborhoods porous, and taste did the rest. A sailor out of Aden learned to like a curry softened with coconut milk on the Malabar coast. A Gujarati merchant wintering in Hormuz picked up a fondness for date syrup drizzled over rice. A visitor in Quanzhou tasted soy pickles that taught a new balance of salt and sour. A pilgrim passing through the Swahili coast found octopus stewed in coconut and clove, then carried the memory home like a pocket charm. Repetition turns novelty into normal. The next voyage, someone asked for the same dish by name. A season later, someone tried making a version with local greens. A decade later, the dish felt inevitable. Think of rice. Across the rim, different varieties and cooking methods met, argued, and married. In some kitchens, rice steamed to separate grains. In others, it simmered into porridge, savory in the morning and sweet at night. In still others, it absorbed broth and spice into layered dishes that traveled under different names: pilaf, pulao, pilau, each with its own rhythm of browning onion, blooming spice, and sealing the pot to finish on a low flame. The technique moved as much as the grain did, a choreography of heat and patience that could be taught by gesture on a threshold, no shared words required. Coconut stitched a broad swath of shorelines into kin, grated and squeezed for milk, sliced into slivers for texture, pressed into oil, charred for smoke. Coconut met local fish and tubers and greens and turned them into something that felt like the coast itself. A stew on Zanzibar spoke to a stew in Kerala, not because one copied the other, but because both learned what the fruit wanted and what the sea gave. Tamarind traveled too, its sourness a steadying force in sauces from Gujarat to Aceh. Shrimp paste, fish sauces, and dried tuna flake, fermentations born of abundance and preservation, added umami to broths and relishes. The ocean's proteins taught cooks to think in weeks instead of hours, to catch and then keep. Spices did not only move as cargo, they rooted in palate. Pepper's small heat, cinnamon's warmth, cloves' anesthetic bloom, cardamom's perfumed lift, each became a way to signal celebration or to turn a simple pot into something that made a returning sailor's eyes water and soften at the same time. The blends were local, masala here, bumbu there, shahi across a gulf, and the ratios changed by hand and by memory. A family recipe might list no amounts, only stages. Onions to gold, spice until fragrant, liquid by the handful. The port gave options, and the kitchen chose. Sweetness had seasons and routes. Date syrup and jaggery met honey and cane in market lanes, and confectioners learned the grammar that turned nuts and seeds and flowers into portable comfort. A traveler could line a pack with sweets that would keep through a crossing, a small insurance against a hard sea or a thin port. In some towns, sugarcane pressed to juice was boiled and boiled again into dense cakes. In others, imported crystals caught light in a vendor's bowl, rare and dear, save for a child's hand on a feast night. The spread of sugar as staple rather than treat would come later. But in this era, sweetness was a punctuation, a marker of good fortune and hospitality. Bread and flatbread kept time with ovens and griddles along the route. Wheat leavened by wild yeasts rose in stone ovens near the Red Sea and Persian Gulf. Rice and lentil batters fermented into lacy pancakes on the western coast of India. Maize was absent, of course, still rooted in the Americas. But millet and sorghum stepped in, ground and griddled for travelers who needed fill and could not afford wheat. Techniques crossed quietly. Someone who learned to slap dough against a tandoor wall used that gesture on a new clay oven down coast. Someone who learned to ferment batter for idli tried a similar patience with a different grain where rice ran scarce. Ports taught flexibility. Diasporas were kitchens unto themselves. Merchant guilds from Gujarat cooked vegetarian feasts in port temples, tithing spice to the gods and community. Hadrami families in Malabar layered meat and rice with a perfume borrowed from across the water. Fujianese traders boiled noodle soups that soothed throats raw from salt air. Jewish communities baked breads with sesame that snapped under teeth. These were enclaves, yes, but not sealed. Neighbors shared plates over walls and through doorways. A borrowed spice stayed, a method stuck. A fast day dish became a favorite, even for those who did not fast. Foodways marked time as surely as calendars. The first catch of a season, the first pressing of oil, the first cut mango in brine. Each was a small ceremony that gathered people into squares and courtyards. Ports turned these calendars into city-wide rhythms. Markets swelled when the winds brought ships. Feasts widened when visitors filled lanes. Quiet seasons condensed into preserving and repair. A cook could look at a stall and know which winds had been kind. Areca nuts piled high, cardamom jars full, tamarind bricks stacked. These were the signs of successful crossings, as clear as mass in the roadstead. Caution belongs here, gentle but firm. It is tempting to draw straight lines from one dish to another and declare parentage, but cuisines are composite, and sources are uneven. Elite kitchens are overrepresented in written accounts. Humble pots speak softly in middens, and the words that survive favor spectacle over the ordinary meals that sustained most lives. Better to hold multiple possibilities at once, a shared technique rather than a single source, a horizon of taste that bent similarly under similar constraints, a local invention sparked by a foreign ingredient, where a spice residue, a cooking vessel's shape, and a traveler's note converge, a line can be inked darker. Where only one speaks, the line should stay light. Ethical note: these foods live on as present tense heritage. When archaeology and chemistry step into kitchens, sampling residues from pots, reading char into dates, they touch traditions that families carry with pride and care. The respectful path is collaboration, asking which stories communities want told, sharing results and credit, and remembering that scientific curiosity does not outrank living meaning. In some places, the right choice is to document through interviews and contemporary practice, leaving the old pots uncut. Quiet moments hold the heart of this part. A Swahili grandmother teaching a grandchild to grind coconut against a stone slab. A Malabari fisherman's wife rinsing rice until the water runs clear. A cook in Aden drawing a circle in the air to show a stranger how fine to slice an onion. A monk on an island unstitching a banana leaf to line a pot. The distances are long, but the gestures are close, and the monsoon's rhythm is there even when the wind is still. There will be time to wait, to share, to learn from the neighbor whose home lies across the sea, but whose kitchen feels like next door. Taste also moved belief, if only a little. Eating together softened distrust. Fasting together taught empathy across faiths. Offerings at shrines, sweet, salty, spicy, became a vocabulary of respect that traveled better than doctrine. A merchant who could not read a neighbor's script could still read a neighbor's stew, and that was sometimes enough to start a friendship or save a voyage by opening a door at the right hour. Let the market fade now, the stalls down to embers, the last pots washed in brackish water under a half moon. The winds will turn in their time, and the ships will go, and the port will inhale again when the next season brings new hands and old hungers. Kitchens will be ready. They remember better than most, because they practice every day. In the next part, we'll turn to myth versus evidence wine, setting seafaring legends beside the quiet data, texts, residues, cores, and seeing where the stories align, where they stretch, and where the science asks for gentler retellings. Settle in and let a scene rise the way mist does over a quiet backwater at dawn. A weathered pilot runs a fingertip along a map scratched into a plank, eyes soft with memory. A younger sailor leans in, hungry for one great tale, the first, the fastest, the bravest crossing that made everything possible. Stories love a single hero. Oceans rarely do. Tonight we'll place a few beloved legends on a calm table, then lay beside them the quieter pieces. Mud, seed, shard, inscription, and see where the edges match, where they don't, and where the picture asks for gentler lines. Begin with the tale that one person discovered the monsoon, throwing open a door no one had found before. In some retellings, a single name becomes a hinge between ages, as if coasts waited in ignorance until a lone navigator felt the wind and wrote it down. The evidence, like the winds, is less dramatic and more durable. Seasonal reversals were legible from land. Farmers felt them. Fishers timed their nets to them, long before any long-haul merchant wrote a guide. What changes in the record is not awareness, but scale and confidence. Early itineraries describe cautious voyages that change short legs. Later compendia list bolder, longer leaps timed to the monsoon's heartbeats. The myth of a singular discovery collapses into a chorus of pilots and port communities, each adding precision, until calendars and contracts could trust the sky's schedule almost as much as they trusted kin. Now, touch another bright story. That one legendary port gathered the world to its key, and then vanished whole, swallowed by storm or fate, leaving only a name and a chest of pepper under sand. It is true that certain harbors pulsed into prominence, then faded as rivers moved mouths or bars thickened. But the archaeology is patient and plural. Harbor cores show not a single cataclysm, but layered change, thicker human signal in busy centuries, thinner in quieter ones, storm horizons like thin charcoal lines, dredge scars healed smooth by time. Shards and inscriptions wander too, reused in later walls, carried inland for new buildings when quays shifted. The myth that a port simply disappeared oversimplifies a shoreline that edits itself each generation. Towns slide along channels the way a hand shifts along a rope. Same grip, new position. Consider the museum favorite, a peppercorn tucked into an elite wrapping, proof that a pharaoh tasted the Malabar Hills. It is an image that fits in the mind like a jewel, and it may well reflect early spice traffic into the Nile world. But historians have learned to prefer convergence over spectacle. A single spectacular find can anchor a narrative unfairly. Stronger is the braid, residues in ordinary pots from warehouses, charred seeds and middens dated securely, shipping notes that list sacks and seasons, stable chemical signatures that repeat across layers and sites. When many small lines point the same way, we can say the pepper was habit, not miracle. The myth shifts from one royal bite to many daily pinches, and the ocean story becomes less glamorous and more human, which is to say, truer. Another old comfort, that whole ship sailed as single ethnicity capsules, culture sealed under a shared flag and language. The written record, composed largely by literate elites, can make it seem so, because authors tended to notice those like themselves. Yet ports that required months of waiting were neighborhoods of necessity. Contracts mention brokers, pilots, translators. Inscriptions thank local patrons. Ceramic mixes in trash pits trace kitchens that blended tastes. Mixed crews are hard to see directly. Texts seldom list everyone aboard, and burials at entrepôts are often disturbed or ethically off limits. But the logistics argue for plurality. A hull needs local knowledge at each landfall. A market needs agents who can cross tongues. A galley needs someone who knows how to coax a stew from unfamiliar greens. The myth of sealed identity yields to a more porous truth. Boats and streets both were polyglot. Fold in a favorite marvel, instant faith on arrival. Stories tell of a monastery seated by a single relic in one season. A mosque springing up with the first foreign sail. A shrine appearing at the edge of a quay as if disembarking. Belief does travel in moments, gifts, visions, vows kept after storms, but the built record is gradual. Foundations appear, then rebuildings. Inscriptions shift from tentative to confident. Decorative styles mix for a while before settling. Linguistic borrowing softens the ground long before doctrines take root. Meals shared and marriages made do their quiet work beside sanctuaries. The myth of overnight conversion is a daytime convenience. Night, when taste and trust grow, moves slower. There's also the enduring idea that all crossings were either timid coasting or fearless blue water leaps, and that an era can be filed under one or the other. Both exist in any century. The winds fix broad windows, currents and confidence fill in the routes. Along dangerous capes or where shoals migrate under river floods, pilots hugged land, reading shoal water color and bird flight at dawn. Across reaches where currents and winds set a straight path at peak season, bolder captains took the open water to save time and risk later shoals. The myth of a single mode does not survive the logs, the guides, the silted channels. The sea asks for a mixed toolkit. Sailors obliged. A gentler correction touches our own era's appetite for firsts. First coconut here, first banana there, first chicken bone with a particular lineage in a particular layer. Firsts matter, they anchor timelines, but the ocean's change is more often about thresholds. A kitchen tries a new fruit once, a market stocks it seasonally for a decade. Only after the third or fourth generation does it become tradition. Ancient DNA and lipids can catch arrivals. Harbor cores can catch intensification. Inscriptions can catch a guild that now trades in the new staple as a matter of course. Myth prefers a debut, evidence prefers an adoption curve. Respect belongs too to a myth that grew as a rebuke to conquest narratives. That Indian Ocean trade was always peaceful, forever cosmopolitan, powerless politics lapping at tolerant shores. The truth is kinder and tougher. Many seasons were peaceful because predictability rewards patience, and because port towns learned that trust is the cheapest insurance. But coercion and exclusion appear in the record alongside hospitality, fortified headlands, customs houses with teeth, guilds that control access, and episodes of violence that leave their signature in burned layers and sudden ceramic breaks. The myth of endless peace flattens a textured history. The evidence asks us to honor both the long quiet and the punctuations. Here is one more, offered with care, the neat period box. Our time window, 1000 BCE to 1400 CE, invites tidy endpoints, the rise of certain empires at one edge, a new naval power just beyond the other. But shorelines and tastes do not obey calendars exactly. Some plant lineages appear earlier, some vessels later, some routes fade while others brighten against the same political backdrop. It is sensible to bracket an era for clarity. It is honest to admit that the sea sands those brackets round. Where consensus is firm, seasonal winds as infrastructure, the redistribution of crops and commensals, the slow stitching of cuisines and beliefs, we can speak plainly. Where debates are active, exact anchoring of certain ports to ancient names, the tempo of specific crossings, the social makeup of crews, we can hold the space open without dramatizing the gap. An ethical note threads through all of this. Myths feed meaning. Communities cherish stories that anchor identity to coast, shrine, and dish. Evidence can feel like an eraser when, done badly, it corrects without care. The right posture is companionship. Where a legend aligns with layers, celebrate the harmony. Where it diverges, offer the small, patient findings as additions rather than negations, and let local custodians lead in how new knowledge sits alongside old tales. Some objects and graves and holy edges are not for sampling. Some answers can wait until a respectful path appears. Close with a simple gesture, a pilot teaching a younger sailor to watch the wind cat's paw across a harbor, to smell rain before it reaches the reef, to taste a stew and know the spice came late to the pot. The big stories shrink to fit these senses. The evidence grows from them. Legend and lab can share a bench when the goal is not victory, but clarity. In the next part, we'll follow beliefs on the breeze, tracing how seasonal waiting and steady crossings carried practices, pilgrimages, and small devotions across the rim, and how faiths found harbors and kitchens and courts alike. Let the harbor be quiet enough to hear sandals on stone. A lantern pools light on a wooden threshold, where a traveler unlaces the day from tired feet, then steps into a small room lined with mats and a single niche holding a brass lamp. The flame is new to this coast, but the gesture is old. Cupped hand, whispered name, gratitude for a safe crossing, promise to keep the season's bargain and wait until the winds turn. In ports around the rim, from the Red Sea to the Swahili littoral, from Sri Lanka to the Straits, Beliefs moved as patiently as cargo, carried by people who waited together and learned to honor each other's clocks. Waiting is the secret engine of devotion here. Seasonal layovers folded strangers into neighborhoods long enough to notice dawn calls, temple bells, drumbeats at dusk. A pilot seeking luck might tie a thread at a shrine beside a quay. A merchant, mindful of vows, might sponsor a meal at a monastery. A sailor far from home might join evening prayers because the cadence felt like shelter. Next season, a small relic arrived in a chest, a palm leaf text, a folded cloth, a carved bead, because the room it would live in had already been made ready by months of company and the soft authority of routine. Follow the wind to Sri Lanka, where the curve of the island gathers ships like an open palm. Monastic centers near ports made room for lay donors whose ledgers and loyalties stretched across water. A carved dedication in one script might name a guild from across the strait. A visiting reader might copy a text to carry east. A pilgrim might learn the geometry of a ritual and repeat it at the next landfall with borrowed tools and earnest hands. This was not conversion by decree, but accretion by presence, layered like the harbor mud. A lamp lit, a story remembered, a gift made, a habit kept. Turn to the western shores of India, where temples near market lanes counted sailors among their donors, and where merchants kept fasts that doubled as schedules. No sale until offerings were done, no offerings until accounts were squared. In coastal towns, shrines to sea-facing deities were practical and tender, places to ask for mercy when a squall bent the mast, or for a fair wind to make the last leg before a bar closed. Symbols crossed more easily than doctrines. A man from a far coast recognized a gesture, hands to brow, a bow, a circle, and joined, then learned the words later, if at all. Southeast Asia braided these threads into something wide and bright. Statues and stories arrived by sea, but so did ritual experts and artisans who knew how to orient a doorway, how to carve a lintel, how to pace a procession to the length of a courtyard. Coastal polities learned to speak several spiritual languages at once, giving land to a monastery whose abbot read from one canon, patronizing a temple whose priests kept another calendar, honoring local spirits at the edges of both. Maritime capitals became places where a traveler could step from incense into incense and still feel the difference. Notes that harmonized but did not blend away. Across the Western Basin, the monsoon synchronized a different set of practices. Law schools traveled with jurists who adjudicated contracts timed to wines. Devotional lineages traveled with scholars and singers who found welcome in stone-built towns, staring out at an empty horizon. Lodges grew up near markets, hospitable to orphans of the sea and to itinerant specialists, the rope splicer, the tailkeeper, the man who could read a star path into a route and a verse into comfort. Some seasons left behind more than memory, a prayer niche in a warehouse wall, a line of script over a door, a stele recording a gift from a captain whose home lay a season away. The Swahili coast tells this in coral and lime. Islands and peninsulas gathered stone towns whose houses opened inward to courtyards and upward to wind towers that tamed heat. Places of prayer nestled near wells and markets, stitched to daily life by call and footstep, by the smell of bread and the sound of trade. Visiting specialists, legal, poetic, mystical, found hosts and students, and in the next waiting season returned with new verses and rulings. Faith here carried the cadence of the sea, reliable, adaptable, measured in weeks and years rather than in proclamations. Paper and stone help us see the threads without chasing certainties too fast. Inscriptions near quays record donors whose names and origins read like tide charts. Letters copied and kept in distant archives mention the turning of winds and the keeping of holy days in the same breath. Portable objects, a small icon, a prayer bead, a stamped tablet, appear in layers that match busy centuries. Architecture whispers too. Foundations rebuilt and widened, decorative programs that blend motifs across canons, orientation that answers both sky and street. The dating is rarely sharp to the year, but the pattern is steady. Presence, then place, then practice. Caution belongs in the telling. It is tempting to map belief like a spice, first here, then there. But devotion sinks roots on a different schedule. A port might welcome a shrine in one season, and only decades later see the practice become common outside its lanes. An elite court could sponsor distant rites ahead of the street. A neighborhood could be devout in its own key, while grand buildings said little. The evidence asks for humility. Let convergences lead. When texts, objects, and built space agree, speak firmly. When they only rhyme, speak softly. There is a question we must keep close. Who, exactly, carried these breezes of belief? The social makeup of crews and dockside labor remains hazy in the record, and that haze matters because ritual authority and practice often ride in the pockets of ordinary people, as much as in the trunks of teachers. We can infer plurality from logistics and from the texture of neighborhoods, but the faces are blurred by time and by the biases of texts that name patrons more readily than cooks and pilots. Future work, carefully and with consent, may tighten the focus through names scratched on walls, through humble dedicatory marks, through the steady work of reading small archives of daily piety. Ethical care is part of the method. Ports are thick with sacred ground: graves, shrines, mosques, temples, lodges, hermitages. Excavation and analysis, even at the edges, must proceed by invitation and with reciprocity. Some places will prefer memory to measurement, and that preference is not an obstacle but a guide. The sea teaches patience, so should the study of devotion. Stillness at dusk holds the whole story in one room. A ship's boy, not yet old enough to climb the shrouds, sits by a doorway and hums a tune learned this season from a neighbor who keeps a different feast. A woman lights a small lamp and places a few grains in a bowl. A man on a flat roof watches the first star and marks a day he has promised to keep. None of this requires a proclamation. All of it rides the same rhythm that fills and empties the roadstead. Belief does not travel alone. It travels with taste. A vow is kept with a sweet. A rite ends with a stew. Fasting teaches empathy because hunger is common language. In kitchens next to sanctuaries, spices loosen tongues, and shared plates make theological essays unnecessary. Trust grows, or does not, over bowls. Let the lantern gutter and the night swell with tide. In the morning, markets will wake, and rituals with them. In a few weeks or months, sails will rise, and new habits will hitch rides across the horizon. The winds do not care about doctrine, people do. But the winds make the meeting possible, and in that meeting, belief becomes practice, and practice becomes place. In the next part, we'll return to the table for cuisines converge, following how staple meets spice, technique meets ingredient, and how plates across the rim learn to echo one another without losing their own voices. Let a kitchen gather around a low flame. A clay pot sweats. A hand stirs gently. A second hand pinches spice between finger and thumb and lets it fall like rain into the steam. The scent is familiar, and also not. It is a memory meeting a new shoreline. This part is a quiet walk through those meetings, where techniques and ingredients learn to speak to one another until a plate could taste like two coasts at once. Begin with the simplest grammar: heat, fat, water, salt. Along the western rim, cooks browned onions low and slow, coaxing sweetness before introducing spice. Along the eastern rim, cooks often built flavor in pastes pounded on stone slabs. Aromatics bruised until they gave up their oils, then bloomed those oils in a hot pan before any liquid touched the surface. Where these grammars met, they made new sentences. A spice paste met the patience of deeply caramelized onion. A stew learned to finish under a sealed lid. The last few minutes a private conversation between grain and aroma. In port towns, a kitchen could borrow a neighbor's technique, the way one might borrow a cup of sugar, and return it, improved by practice. Grain set the table. Rice learned many lives across the rim, and then taught them to each other. A cook who knew how to coax separate grains by steaming learned, in a new neighborhood, to let rice drink spiced broth into its core, and then rest tight under a cloth while the heat fell away. Another cook, who had grown up with porridge that carries a house through morning, learned to fold rice into cakes and batters that rise softly on griddles, turning a bowl of ferment into lace. At a stall near a harbor, names traded places as easily as coins. Pilau, pulau, pilaf, variations that differed in order and emphasis, but shared the same idea of fat kissed with spice, rice added and made to glisten, liquid measured by the eye, flame lowered, patience practiced. Millets and sorghum stood in where climates demanded resilience, and those grains learned to carry spice and broth just as generously, their flavors darker, their textures more grounding. Coconut tied wide shores into kin. The curve of its shell fit palm and blade. The white of its flesh met stone to become milk and cream. Its oil held high heat in a lightly sweet perfume that softened sharp chilies and brightened sour tamarind. A fish stew thickened with coconut on one coast spoke directly to a vegetable curry, finished with coconut on another, and to a skillet of greens glossed with coconut oil further west again. When traders waded through a season, they learned how to grate, knuckles closed but safe, how to squeeze fresh milk twice from the same pulp, how to fry curry leaves until they sang. Those sounds and scents traveled better than words. Sourness offered balance and kept food safe in hot months. Tamarind blocks, glossy and sticky, dissolved into pots up and down the routes. Vinegar born of date, palm, or cane joined in, the choice shifting by port. Citrus added its daylight in season. Ferments hummed in jars. Fish sauces like whispers of tide. Shrimp systems that smell louder in the making than in the eating. Dried fish flakes shaved into broths, turning water into memory of sea. Across kitchens, these sours and umamis trained palates toward complexity. A stew that first opens sweet with onion gives way to a warm spice, then to a gentle sour that steadies everything and keeps the spoon seeking. Spice blends were local dialects with shared roots. Pepper gave a bass pulse. Cinnamon and cassia added warmth. Clove pricked like a small bell. Cardamom lifted aromas into the nose. Cumin and coriander grounded with earth. Fenugreek added its subtle maple bitterness. Mustard seed popped joy into oil, and then went quiet, leaving behind depth. Cooks chose according to season, purse, and guest. In busy years when ships arrived in good number, jars filled and mixtures grew more generous. In leaner years, frugality sharpened creativity. A smaller pinch, a slower fry, a longer rest to let the little do more. A borrowed blend might arrive whole and then adjust by hand over time, so that a dish kept its shape but wore a local face. Sweetness was punctuation, not a flood. Date syrup, palm sugar, cane jaggery, honey, each brought not just sweet, but aroma and trace minerals that deepen flavor. Confections were portable kindness, sesame brittle and nut bars, sugar-dusted pastries that could travel in a pocket, spiced cakes that keep their tenderness because syrup was cooked to just the right thickness. Into these sweets crept subtle exchanges, a spice from a far coast in a familiar dough, a technique for frying at a particular temperature learned from a neighbor who keeps a different holy day. Feast tables told history without needing to say it aloud. Bread and pancakes kept time with devotion and work. Leavened loaves baked against hot walls. Flatbreads slapped and turned by hands that knew heat by feel. Sour batters poured into hot rings and covered, rising lace at the edges and tender centers. A griddle became a map of exchange. Wheat and barley, where they grew easily. Rice-lentil ferments, where grain and pulse shared a bowl. Coconut-enriched batters and humid belts that favored their gentle tang. Even the tools spoke to one another. A clay oven learned to hold heat longer, with a different mix of chaff in the clay. A pan borrowed a new shape to encourage browning, at the risk of sticking, until someone learned the right oil. Legumes and greens did the quiet, sustaining work. Lentils met coconut and curry leaf. Chickpeas met tamarind and dried fish. Cowpeas learned to love mustard seed. Leafy greens took on the perfume of ginger and the solidity of groundnut paste in a stew whose technique crossed from another shore. These dishes often remain invisible in grand histories because they live under the level of spectacle. But they are exactly where exchange settles, not in the one-off feast, but in the repeated, daily, careful bowl that holds a family together. Constraints traveled with technique. Dietary laws and fasting calendars structured weeks and months in ways that shaped menus and shopping. Ports learned to accommodate these rhythms, turning diverse needs into steady custom. A vendor who knows how to fry without animal fat, a sweet maker who keeps a separate pan, a spice grinder who will certify a blend as pure to one standard or another. Over time, these accommodations became features, not exceptions, and cuisines grew richer because kitchens learned how to feed more kinds of bodies with care. Voyages shaped cooking on board and then on land. Provisions had to keep: dried fish, pickled vegetables, salted meats where permitted, flatbreads and biscuits, pulses that sprout easily for fresh greens at sea. A ship's cook learned to handle smoke and sway, to stack pots so one flame did 3 jobs, to salvage a dish flecked with ash and turn it into memory by adding a pinch of the right spice at the right moment. When crews waited out a season ashore, some of those habits stayed: a fondness for pickles at breakfast, a taste for strong tea, a method of layering grain and spiced broth learned, because it makes sense in a pot that should not be stirred after the lid goes on. Neighborhoods held it all together. Diasporic communities cooked core dishes to taste like home, and then extended a hand across alleys. a vegetarian feast shared with fish eaters who discover joy in spice-tempered lentils. A meat and rice celebration shared with those who do not eat that meat by offering special sweets and fragrant breads. A famine recipe taught to neighbors and then kept as comfort food long after scarcity passes. Cooks are practical and generous by trade. When an ingredient is new, the question is not whose it is, but what it wants in the pan and how it behaves on the tongue. It is important to keep the tone honest. Some correspondences are surely convergent, different coasts solving similar problems with similar tools. Not every resemblance marks a route. Yet when techniques align with documented routes and waiting seasons, when spice signatures and cookware match the stories neighbors tell, when a stew's structure echoes a method carried by a guild known to winter in that port, then it is fair to say that cuisines learned each other's steps. The monsoon gave the rehearsal schedule. People made the dance. This convergence did not erase difference. If anything, it sharpened local character by offering contrast. A port bowl could hold a spice blend recognizable 3 harbors away and still taste unmistakably of its water, its greens, its oil, its cook's hand. Cuisines that travel and stay generous survive. They offer enough sameness to comfort a sailor and enough difference to delight a child raised in one alley, eating at a friend's house in the next. Before the flame goes out, picture a last scene. Dusk, a courtyard, a pot coming off the fire to rest under a cloth. Someone inhales and says, "Yes, it's right." In that yes sits 1,000 small trades of method, ingredient, patience, and love. It is the taste of an ocean full of coasts teaching one another how to feed the night. In the next part, we'll enter the lab walkthrough, a calm tour of the pipeline from sample to signal, how archaeologists and scientists move from shard and seed to timelines and routes, and where the limits of measurement live. Step quietly into white light and low hum, where doors close with a sigh and a sign reads, "Clean room." This is where fragments become voices. Seed to sequence, shard to spectrum, mud to timeline. The lab is not a drama. It is choreography, slow and repeatable, more lullaby than fanfare. We'll walk the pipeline from sample to signal and pause at the places where the method itself whispers its limits. Begin at intake. A seed, a sherd, a pinch of harbor silt, a sliver of tooth. Each arrives with a small biography. Where, which layer, which neighbor artifacts kept it company, how the sample traveled. That context is not decoration, it is half the meaning. A conservator photographs, numbers, and logs, then wraps the object against dust and touch. Like sailors checking lines before a tide, technicians check chain of custody before any tool is warmed. A sample without a story is a smaller thing than it could have been. Turn left to the clean corridor. Ancient DNA, if it survives at all, is a skittish guest. Air is filtered, suits are sealed, faces mask behind shields. Surfaces gleam because bleach and UV have stripped them of yesterday. Under a hood, a fragment becomes powder, and even the drill bit is counted, cleaned, and counted again. For plant traces, banana, clove, coconut, the targets are often chloroplast stretches that differ enough between lineages to act like a passport. For animals, rats, chickens, mitochondrial regions map maternal lines that spread like nets across oceans. Library prep turns broken strands into barcoded molecules. There is a kindness in the expectation of damage. Ancient DNA often bears a particular wear pattern at its ends. Seeing it is a reassurance that time, not a stray fingerprint, made the sequence. Target capture can fish for specific regions. Shotgun can listen for everything at once. Either way, replication and negative controls are the quiet guardrails. When a lineage falls into place and points across water, it does so after many small, careful steps that are more housekeeping than heroics. Down the hall, chemistry turns clay and char into taste. Pots are porous. They keep secrets. Under a fume hood, a clean blade lifts a thin shaving from a vessel's interior, the layer that faced stew or spice. Solvents coax out lipids, long-chain molecules from oils, waxes, resins. Gas chromatography separates them by the time they take to pass through a column. Mass spectrometry weighs and fragments them into a skyline of peaks, each a tiny voice. Cloves' phenolics have a shape that is given to mistake when the reference library is good. Cinnamon's aldehydes tell their own story. Plant waxes from coconut and similar palms have distinctive long tails. Sometimes, to be surer still, compound-specific isotope analysis adds a second signature, how much heavy carbon a molecule carries, a hint of its photosynthetic past. One spectrum can mislead. A chorus across layers and vessels builds trust. Heat alters these molecules, so technicians learn to read scorch and simmer in ratios, the way a sailor reads water in color bands. At the bench by the window, powders from harbor cores dry on glass. A core is time in a tube, fine clays like quiet days, coarse sands like storms, charcoal flecks like kitchens and kilns next to water, pollen like a windblown catalog of trees and fields. Subsamples head to microscopes for microfossils, to ovens for loss on ignition that estimates how much life the mud once held, to instruments that sniff for biomarker molecules, tar from pitched hulls, faint spice traces that settled as dust, fecal sterols that track population density near the basin. For dates, short-lived charcoal anchors years, shells are corrected for the marine reservoir, sometimes optically stimulated luminescence steps in to clock when grains last felt sunlight. A timeline is not a single point, but a band of likelihood. Bayesian models reconcile many anchors into a quieter, steadier curve. The harbor often reveals its busiest centuries as thickened, dark, life-rich layers. At a metal table, a tooth gleams under a lamp. Enamel is a journal set in mineral. A pinhead of powder from a growth band goes to isotope ratios. Strontium follows bedrock. Oxygen follows water. Carbon and nitrogen whisper diet. A goat born inland and sold to a port will write both places into its enamel. A person whose childhood drank a different rain than adulthood will leave a two-place signature in tooth and bone. Commensal animals, rat, chicken, record fast histories. Their lineages and isotopes reflect changes within a few seasons or years, a scale that can match the tempo of voyages and markets. Paper and stone arrive here too. Epigraphy may share the room with microscopes, because both work best when details are crisp. Inscriptions name donors, guilds, winds, and months. A translation is more than language. It is context, where the slab was found, whether it was reused in a later wall, whether the formula matches others from the region and era, or stands odd in a way that suggests travel. When an inscription that thanks a merchant guild from far away sits above core layers that swell with human signal at the same centuries, the lab smiles at the convergence. Cross-checking becomes a habit. Name to layer, layer to residue, residue to route. The method rewards patience more than it rewards imagination. Limits live everywhere, and naming them is part of the work. Ancient DNA contaminates easily. Controls catch some of the risk, but never all. Lipid residues can be equifinal, two different ingredients yielding similar peaks. Without a strong reference library, and when possible, a second axis of certainty, caution is honest. Harbor layers mix, burrowing organisms churn mud, storms smear time, multiple cores, careful sedimentology, and an ear for echo and geophysics help. But they do not make mud into marble. Isotopes confound, regions can share geologies. Water can be traded and stored. Diets can blur. Inscriptions move from original contexts. A beautiful text in a later wall tells two stories, not one. Bayesian models are only as good as their inputs and priors. A spurious date can pull a curve too far unless flagged and tested. Because the lab touches the past to hear it, an ethical note belongs in every room. Sampling is destructive at tiny scales. A seed drilled becomes dust. A sliver of tooth becomes numbers. A sherd gives up a thin slice of its history to write another. Permits and community consent are not formalities. They are the floor. Some contexts, burial grounds, active shrines, venerated ruins, are not for the drill today, and maybe not tomorrow. There is honorable work at the edges. Interviews with keepers of recipes and names, non-invasive surveys, samples from fill and refuse rather than from altars and graves. Data should travel home the way sailors do, with gifts, shared results, open archives where appropriate, training and jobs for local students, co-authorship that reflects who did the knowing, not just who held the instrument. Why now, in the lab's own key, is simple. Machines have grown more sensitive, protocols more robust, models more transparent. 20 years ago, a sentence about a spice from a pot might have been a hope. Now, carefully, it can be a claim. 10 years ago, a commensal lineage across water might have felt like a hunch. Now, with better reference genomes and stricter authentication, it reads like a root. Harbor cores, once scarce, are being logged and shared in ways that let coasts be compared like chapters in one long book. The risk remains to overread and oversell. The reward is to let many small, independent measures braid into a line that can bear weight. Before we leave, step into a small side room, quiet as a chapel, where failures live without shame. A library yields no signal, a residue reads ambiguous, a date refuses to settle into a sequence without straining it. These are not dead ends, they are signposts. Try a different target, build a better library, seek another core 3 meters away, go back to the site plan and look again at the layer. The monsoon's lesson fits here. Patience, repetition, trust the season, wait for the window, then move. The lab does not replace the boat, the market, the kitchen, the shrine. It translates them. It asks mud to remember, seed to speak, shard to breathe out, a ghost of stew. When enough of these whispers say the same thing, an ocean's rhythm grows audible indoors. Then the door opens, the suit comes off, and someone steps back into sunlight, onto a street where lunch is being made, in a style that crossed water long ago, and became local by being loved. In the next part, we'll return to the water for monsoon risk and skill, how pilots measured danger and time, how hulls and sails turn knowledge into safety, and how communities manage the long wait between seasons. Step onto a wooden deck at dawn, when the light is pewter and the sea is more felt than seen, and listen to the sounds a careful crew makes before the day begins. The low talk around a coil of rope, the slide of a palm on a spar to check for splinters, the thrum of a line tested and made ready. Risk lives here, but not as drama. It lives as routine. Skill answers it the way breath answers a long hill, steady, measured, knowing when to push and when to wait. The monsoon gives windows, not guarantees. Pilots knew this and broke the season into finer pieces. First breezes, steadies, late lulls, and the treacherous edges when wind shifts before swells do. Leaving too early means headwinds that force tacking and waste food and water. Leaving too late means meeting the first long ground swells of the returning season in narrow approaches. In harbors with bars at the mouths of rivers, the angle of the swell is everything. A good window lets the bar lie flat. A bad one throws steep water across the channel and turns a simple exit into a trial. Risk here is a question of timing and of knowing a bar's moods the way one knows a neighbor's. Currents complicate and often save. Along the Horn and down the Swahili coast, the Somali current flips with the season. In the heart of the ocean, counterflows cut across, like rivers beneath the roads. A pilot with a good mental map can let current do part of the work, running a lane that seems wrong by compass but right by speed over ground. In the Laccadive Sea, eddies form like invisible hills and hollows. A practiced eye reads surface texture, cat's paw here, slick there, and trim sail to take the gift. Running with the flow conserves provisions. Fighting it shortens tempers and frays lines. Hull and rig are risk management written in wood and cloth. Sewn plank hulls, their strakes stitched rather than nailed, flex in a sea that would creak a rigid frame to pieces. That supple give absorbs chop and spreads shock. The lateen sail, with its long slanting yard, answers gusts quickly. A hand at the sheet can ease in a heartbeat, and a second hand at the tack can change a boat's mind without breaking it. Reefing early, tying down a smaller, stronger triangle of canvas before wind demands it, is a quiet creed. It turns storms from enemies into stern teachers. A good crew reefs at the first hint, not the first break. Navigation is risk pared down to habits. A small wooden board held at arm's length against the height of Polaris, the simplest latitude keeper, reduces a large world to a steady line. Stars in their seasons are companions, but so are swells felt through the hull when cloud erases the sky. Birds at dawn point toward land. A change in watercolor hints at shoal. The lead line, tipped with fat to bring up a pinch of bottom, tells depth and ground, mud, sand, shell, and a pilot's memory ties that sample to a chart drawn in the mind. Landfall and haze becomes a patient approach. Sound, watch, wait for smell. The green of an island, the tannin of a river, the resin near shipyards. Stormcraft is a culture of choices. Heaving to, backing a small sail and lashing the tiller so the boat sits quietly, drifting but safe, can turn chaos into survivable time. Running off under reduced canvas accepts that steering is better than fighting. The crew resecures every jar and board, moves weight low and central, and rides. A sea anchor, a rough cone or mat dragged ahead, keeps the bow into the worst of it. None of this is romantic. It is wet and cold and heavy. But the routine itself is warmth. Tasks define safety when sight and sound blur. Shoreside practices are part of the seamanship that never makes it into tall tales. Careening, a hull laid over on a quiet beach to scrape weeds and barnacles, restores speed and control. Hot pitch worked into seams after a thorough dry-out keeps the ocean out and lets timbers swell evenly when the boat floats again. Rope is stitched and spliced constantly. A frayed eye repaired in calm is a life saved later. A ship's carpenter moves through the world with adzes, augers, and patience. A sailmaker listens to cloth talk and wind and chooses patches that align fibers and future loads. Provisions are a risk ledger of their own. A voyage counts days by water first, then staples. Jars of grain, sacks of rice, pulses that sprout quickly for fresh greens, dried fish and pickles for salty umami that lifts flat meals, all are weighed against expected time and a margin for trouble. Fire uses fuel, fuel takes space, space takes away cargo. A ship's cook manages morale as much as calories, coaxing comfort from flatbread crisped on a griddle, or a stew scented with a pinch of precious spice, saved for nights when the sea will not let anyone sleep. Illness is managed with order, rotations, rest where possible, work shared and shifted. Ports turn risk into economics. Waiting seasons cost money. Communities respond with credit and care. Contracts peg interest to wins. If the season is missed, terms change. If a storm forces a put-in at an unscheduled port, a web of brokers and guilds turns stranded cargo into solvency, or at least into survival. Insurance exists in custom, shared risk among partners, and in ritual, offerings before departure that bind the living to a promise of return, but also quietly, promise material help to families if the promise fails. Risk is pooled because the winds are shared. Information is a safety net. Pilots talk. In a low-roofed room by a quay, a map is updated with words. A new shoal where a river shifted, a beacon repaired, a hostile headman replaced by a gentler cousin, an epidemic in a town upriver. Knowledge flows along kin lines and guilds, but storms break hierarchies. A careful community makes room for an outsider's news when the stakes are high. Reputation may be the single strongest technology against danger. A pilot known to be cautious is hired by those who prefer a sure arrival to a quick one. A captain famous for bringing crews home can negotiate better credit on departure and better prices on return. Consensus among sailors and scholars alike respects this. The monsoon's predictability reduces systemic risk, but seamanship remains a practiced art, not a solved equation. Minority debates live in the details, how often in earlier centuries crews took open water shortcuts versus coast-hugging chains, whether particular hull types favored certain tactics, how far instrument use, boards and knots, simple sighting tools, penetrated beyond elite pilots. The answers likely vary by region, season, and century. What holds steady is the pattern, windowed opportunity, careful preparation, skillful adaptation. Uncertainties we carry forward are human ones. Crew composition and hierarchy at sea remain fogged by texts that privilege owners and patrons over pilots and cooks. Burial grounds at ports, where isotopes could trace origins and diet, are often disturbed or ethically off-limits. Oral traditions from boat-building families and pilot lineages hold detail and nuance that can clarify practices. Storm tactics, favored lanes near headlands, repair recipes for pitch and oil, but these are living heritages, not archives to be rated. Listening, not extracting, is the ethic. Learning under consent is the method. On the quietest nights, risk and skill come down to hands. A hand on a tiller, feeling the boat's wish before it speaks. A hand on a halyard, ready to ease. A hand on another's shoulder, steadying in darkness. The monsoon writes the broad calendar. People write the day's safety in small, repeated gestures till they become second nature. In this way, across centuries, the ocean becomes not tamed, but companionable, and an economy of patience and craft carries food and ideas along its winds. As the horizon brightens, a pilot tastes the air, checks the set of a distant swell against the feeling in the hull, and nods. Not today. Tomorrow, perhaps. This is risk-turned wisdom. To know that waiting is also sailing, just not yet underway. In the next part, we'll climb a coconut palm in the mind and look at coconut republics, how how a single tree and its many uses knit together shores, cuisines, shipyards, and trade from East Africa to island Southeast Asia. Climb, slowly and safely, in the mind's body up a coconut palm at dawn, the trunk ringed with old leaf scars like a memory ladder. The air cool at first, and then suddenly green-warm as the crown opens to sky. The fronds hiss with the sea breeze. A myna scolds and then quiets. Below, the beach is a pale ribbon, and beyond it the water glints the color of tin. Settle there for a breath and look out along the rim of the Indian Ocean, because this one tree, useful in parts from root to leaf tip, binds these shores as tightly as any charted route ever did. A coconut is a seed with its own boat. The husk is corked against salt, the shell hard, the embryo patient. You can imagine it falling from a palm, riding out through lagoon and reef, and waiting without fuss for the right sand to welcome it. People nudged that wandering, planting where the wind and the market said it would be wise. At the edge of backwaters in Kerala, in sandy belts along the Swahili coast, in the spray-salted skirts of islands from Sri Lanka to Sumatra. A planted grove meant shade, food, fiber, oil, sugar, vinegar, and water in one living kit. A village that learned the tree's habits learned to weather seasons more gently. This is a kitchen tree first. Grate the white flesh, squeeze it with warm water. The first pressing shines thick and fragrant, a cream that calms heat and carries spice without blunting it. The second pressing is thinner, perfect for simmering until sauce and stew come to terms. The oil holds a frying heat that can turn plantain to gold and okra to gloss. Leaves line steamer baskets and wrap fish snugly with a perfume that smells like a warm shoreline, even in the cool of dawn. Toddy, drawn at first light from a cut spadix, ferments almost while it drips. Boiled, it becomes jaggery, sticky sweet and smoky, a sweetness that travels in pockets and contracts alike. In Port Lanes, a vendor with a scraper and a small stack of bowls can turn a single nut into a dozen breakfasts that taste like a beginning. It is a shipyard tree, too. Quar rope, made by soaking husk until fibers loosen, then twisting them into lines that do not fear salt, is both the sewing that holds plank to plank and the lashing that binds spar to mast. A sewn plank hull listens to waves and flexes back. Quire takes the strain and returns to shape. In a sea where iron rusts and shipworm eats soft wood, coir and well-chosen timber, pitch and patience, make durability from what the shore gives freely. Nets knotted from quire dry on sand like drawn lace, catching a day's worth of small fish that smell of tide and sun when they meet the pan. A grove is also a bank. Nuts can be counted against debt. Oil can be traded when spice is scarce. Fiber can be spun in the waiting season when winds say stay. The calendar of the palm, the time from flower to nut, the lull between harvests, the sweet window for toddy, gives families a work rhythm that fits the monsoon's larger frame. Plant a ring of palms around a house, and you have shade that breathes. Plant belts along a coast, and you have windbreaks that soften storms. An island remade by coconuts feels, in the heat of afternoon, cooler than its bare cousin, and a shady path between trunks is a kind of public good. Coconut is ceremony and craft. A first fruit offered at a shrine has a sound when it splits that elders hear as an omen. A thread dipped in oil and passed along a doorstep promises safety. A leaf folded into a toy, or a basket becomes an hour saved for a mother's hands. In some courts, a coconut appears in law and gift. Its use is written into fees and favors. In others, it sits humble but steady at the edge of every table, binding hospitality to something more than words. The tree is not neutral, it is beloved. Asked for, thanked. There is a quieter chemistry at work that helps stories meet method without breaking the tone. Coconut leaves behind long-chained waxes in pots and soils where it was pressed and cooked. Those molecules, stubborn and distinctive, cling to sherds and harbor layers and whisper a presence that aligns with the visible groves. In kitchens near busy quays, residues on grinding stones and pans sometimes carry that faint sign, tucked alongside the signatures of spices. The lab can hear it. The nose already knew it. Together, a pattern settles. Coconuts, not just as trees in silhouette, but as fats and fibers that built meals and hulls. Variation matters. There are many kinds of coconut, some thin-shelled and sweet-watered, some stout and meat-rich, some palms give more toddy, others more fiber. Gardeners select without fanfare, and local strains show their preferences in the tastes of a town. A curry that glosses differently, a sweet that sets more firmly, a rope that lasts another season. Trade moves these differences slowly. A sapling rides in a pot on deck, tended as carefully as a child. If it takes root far from home, it changes not only flavor, but also work and income. A grove can tilt a village's calendar. A new strain can tilt a village's math. Coconut also casts a long ecological shadow. Palms drink brackish water and salt wind and still give. Their roots stitch dunes. Their leaves quiet rain so soil does not wash away in a single storm. Planted without thought, they can shoulder out other trees that hold different birds, different insects, different stories. Planted with care, they stand among mangroves and fruit trees and gardens, housekeeping the coast. Farmers who know the wind leave gaps for air, space for undergrowth, and room for paths that keep the grove welcoming to people and to the small lives that make a shoreline resilient. As with every generous thing, there are edges to mind. The tree's usefulness made it a magnet for overuse in some eras. Groves pushed where they could not thrive without labor that cost more than the nut would pay. In other places, the handspan of land between palm and tide was marked as someone's forever, and old footpaths narrowed into tolls. In calm telling, we can hold both truths: coconut as commonwealth, and coconut as controlled, coconut as freedom from hunger, and coconut as fee. Ports turn abundance into markets. Markets turn palms into ledgers. Families navigate both. Ethical note: coastal groves often shelter graves and small shrines. Coring near their roots or cutting old wood for dates and growth lines is work that begins with permission and sometimes stops at the first no. Recipes that live in families are not merely data. When shared, they are gifts that obligate care in how they are retold and where the credit rests. Where the palm touches worship, there is a duty of gentleness in asking and a willingness to hear that some stories want to remain home. Consensus holds the outline steady. Coconut traveled widely around the rim, aided by its own buoyancy and by human planting. It fed and employed and cooled and tied. Its fibers and fats appear in the tools and pots of people who waited for winds and made lives along their edges. The debates live in the fine grain. Which strains moved first where? Which techniques in rope and oil making crossed which straits when? Which words for palm and nut are oldest on a given coast? Those questions are solvable in part by small, patient work. The larger truth is visible from a crown at dawn. Descend now from the palm, the feet finding notches without hurry, the hands trusting bark that has held many bodies, the breath slow. At the base, a basin carved from an old shell holds water for a dog. A coil of coir waits for fingers. A pot, lined with leaf, waits to be filled. The sea speaks in its usual way just beyond the sand. The wind has something to say, and everyone here knows it will speak more loudly soon. In the next part, we'll turn to amphorae and lipids, following how cargo vessels and humble kitchen pots trapped microscopic clues to spices, oils, and resins, and how those traces help map routes and routines across harbors and centuries. Hold a broken rim in the mind's hand, clay the color of dried blood, tiny white inclusions catching light, pores you could mistake for the skin of a fruit, and along the inner wall a faint dark sheen where cargo once pressed and breathed. Smell is imagination here. Tar, a whisper of resin, maybe an echo of spice released again by sun. But this shard is a map even without a nose. Amphorae and jars are the traveling stomachs of an ocean. Humble cooking pots are its remembering tongues. Between them, oils and resins, pastes and pitch have seeped into pores and stayed long after words fell silent. Tonight, we listen to those quiet traces. Picture a storeroom near a quay, rows of pointed jars stacked in sand to hold them upright. Globular vessels cradled in rope slings, local pots blackened from the cook fire and set to cool. Some jars once crossed whole basins, slim torpedoes easy to roll, thick shoulders made for lifting, fabrics that betray a workshop by grit and temper. Others never left a coastline, and their lives were the daily commute between market and hearth. When they broke, they fell into middens and harbor mud. When they cracked, they were patched and repurposed. When they survived, they did so by accident and patience. All the while, their pores kept a ledger in molecules. At the bench, a sliver is lifted from an inner surface with a clean blade, the way one might shave a curl from a soft wood. The powder falls into solvent, and after a gentle coaxing, becomes a solution full of long chain whispers, fatty acids from oils and meats, waxes from plants, terpenes from resins, the aromatic signatures of certain spices that cling even after boiling in years. A column separates these by how quickly they slip through. A detector weighs and fragments them into a skyline of peaks. Each peak is shy, none a headline on its own, but together they arrange into a cityscape a trained eye can read. Lauric and myristic acids that hint at coconut, palmitic and stearic in ratios that narrow the field, phenolic voices that fit clove more snugly than other aromatics, cinnamaldehyde's warm geometry standing where cinnamon once stood, balsamic residues that belong to conifer pitch, carried from cooler forests to seal seams in ships and jars alike. Resinous traces matter because they tell two stories at once. Pitch inside a jar might mean a lined interior meant to carry something sticky or precious without loss. Pitch on an exterior seam speaks of maintenance, a boat drawn up and caulked on a quiet shore under a hard sun. In a harbor core, a horizon rich in tar molecules can mark seasons when a fleet lingered and shipwrights worked without hurry, a chemical tally of waiting. In that same horizon, a rise in kitchen fat says pots were busy. Add in faint spice molecules, and a picture appears of a port thick with life. Repairs, cooking, trading, sleeping, praying, all layered together in the mud. Amphorae were not always what romance expects. Many did not carry wine, many carried oil, fish sauce, resins, syrups, even dry goods. Some were lined with resin to keep flavors from crossing. Some were raw clay that happily drank what they held, and later broken told the tale. A jar's shape and fabric can point to a shoreline and century. The residue can then refine that guess into a route and a room. A slim jar with certain grit in the clay might say, "Workshop here." A cinnamon signal inside it may say, "Cargo there." The jar's fine spot says, "Use here." The triangle closes. Origin, transit, destination. Local cooking pots often hold the most intimate truths. Their pores capture recipes rather than cargo lists. The repeated presence of coconut milk in one neighborhood, a stew that always began with frying onion and spices, and so leaves a predictable ratio of heated lipids, a paste thick with clove from a festival dish that stains the same vessel once a year. Scraping a rim and finding a tiny suite of spice molecules is less glamorous than a shipwreck full of amphorae, but it does something shipwrecks cannot. It brings a kitchen back to life, with its sounds and its budget and its care. When identical signatures appear in many pots in a single layer, a habit emerges. When that habit lines up with periods when ships brought certain goods reliably, a cuisine's adoption curve sharpens from supposition into shape. Harbor sediments catch what kitchens and holds shed. Spice dust rides air and drifts onto water. Wash-ups from decks carry oils and pastes into basins. Workshops and kitchens leak microscopic memory into the tide. A core through that mud, dated layer by layer with charcoal and shell and careful modeling, can reveal bulges of life. More charcoal where fires burned hot. More lipids where cooking swelled. More pitch in seasons of repair. Faint but consistent aromatic traces that suggest a port not just received spice, but used it widely enough that the basin kept a record of breath and steam. Method is no stronger than its references. Libraries of known compounds, built from modern plants and ancient residues alike, anchor identifications. Where molecules overlap, two plants sharing a similar signal, analysts turn to combinations rather than single peaks, to the company that compounds keep in a sample. In some cases, a second dimension adds certainty. Compound-specific isotope ratios lean one way for one plant, another way for its cousin, because their photosynthetic pathways and growing conditions differed. It is a craft of cross-check and chorus, not of solitary eureka. Reuse complicates the story and enriches it. A jar that carried resin one season might carry oil the next, and a syrup after that. Its inner wall will tell all three tales in layers or in blends. A cooking pot that once simmered fish may later specialize in sweets. The lipid skyline will shift over time, but traces of older use often remain like faint ink under a palimpsest. Honest interpretation admits this and prefers weights of evidence. Repeated signatures in multiple vessels, aligned with the right dates and supported by the right pottery forms, over a single glamorous spectrum. There are debates, and they are healthy. Does a particular aromatic definitely mark clove in a tropical pot? Or could another plant in the same family confuse the picture? Do medium-chain fatty acids in a residue surely point to coconut, Or could certain animal fats mimic the pattern after long heating? Did this or that amphora type truly move along the route tradition assigns? Or did workshops travel and fabrics blur? The patient answers enlarge rather than shrink the story. Pair chemistry with vessel fabric. Pair vessel with context. Pair both with harbor cores and inscriptions. Watch for convergence. Where it sings, speak clearly. Where it only hums, hum along and mark the question. An ethical note belongs wherever blades touch heritage. Each scrape is destructive at a tiny scale. Choice matters. Sample from sherds already broken, from contexts that are robustly documented, from vessels that will not be weakened by a sliver taken. Ask first. Always. Curators, communities, custodians. Some storerooms hold sacred jars. Some kitchens sit within living memory. Some ports' edges are grave grounds under coconut shade. In those places, listening may be the only right method, and analogy, the study of nearby, more permissive contexts, the only right inference. Data that come home should travel with acknowledgments, with open sharing where agreed, and with co-authorship that mirrors who held knowledge, not just who held instruments. Step back to the shard in the hand. The pores are small, but they are faithful. If the jar once held something sweetened with palm sugar, a ghost may remain. If it was sealed with resin tapped from a pine far from the tropics, a resin acid will still be telling its origin story. If it was used in a kitchen where coconut and spice met fish and greens, the ratio of heated fats will betray the order of cooking, like footsteps preserved in mud. Thousands of such whispers, across sites and centuries, amount to a kind of chorus audible even to tired ears at the end of a long day. There is a quiet joy in this kind of knowing. It does not overturn legends, it adjusts them. It does not chase heroes, it honors habits. It brings the spice routes down from maps to the weight of a pot lifted from a line of fire bricks, to a jar rolled off a boat and wedged in sand, to a smear of pitch on a thumb that smelled of forest in a town that did not know trees like that. Amphorae and lipids, pots and pores, they widen sight until it can include what kitchens and keys did as a matter of course. Let the storeroom dim. Outside, the harbor heaves its slow breath. Inside, vessels rest in stacks, their stories boxed and labeled, and still, until another question opens them gently and asks what they remember. In the morning, a different fragment will come to the bench, and the same patience will apply, because in the tropics, as at sea, rhythm is knowledge. In the next part, we'll face uncertainty's eye, naming the open questions about crews, labor, and daily life on deck and ashore, and the kinds of careful evidence that might narrow those gaps without trespass. Set the shoulders down and soften the gaze, because this is the calm room where questions are named without hurry, where the horizon looks near and far at once, and where admitting what is not yet known is a kind of seamanship in its own right. The monsoon gives reliable windows, and much of the story follows that rhythm. Still, there are patches of fog that patience and new methods will thin, if care and consent guide the way. Begin with the decks themselves. Who stood watch in the dark swells between headlands? Who mended lines by lamplight? Who cooked when the fire had to be safe and small? These details remain blurred by sources that privilege owners and patrons over pilots and hands. Elite travelers record markets, courts, and marvels. Logbooks name captains and cargo more readily than cooks and carpenters. Mixed crews are likely, pilots taken on at hazardous headlands, translators hired in hubs, kin-based teams that stitched voyages into family calendars, but the proportions, hierarchies, and wages are still sketch lines where we want shading. Names scratched on pots and walls may help, if found and read in place. So might ship timbers marked with builders' signs that tie to work gangs and lineages. For now, the daily mesh of labor aboard, the choreography of sail, rope, rudder, and hearth, belongs mostly to careful inference. Next, a hesitation at the waterline between ship and shore. Were women present at sea as traders, healers, or cooks, or largely anchored to port economies as lenders, vendors, and managers of waiting seasons? Texts omit more than they reveal, and modern analogies risk projection. Port neighborhoods show women's hands in kitchens and markets. Legal documents hint at women as creditors and guarantors. Gravestones and shrine dedications sometimes name mothers and daughters alongside guilds. Whether those roles reached onto decks with any regularity remains an open human question that turns on evidence we must approach with respect. Names in humble inscriptions, oral histories in boat-building families, and where consent exists, isotopes, and biomolecules that can trace life histories without erasing dignity. A larger ledger lies in shadow, ownership and capital. Credit practices pegged to wines are visible in principle, but how far risk shared across partners trickled down to wages and rations is less clear. Insurance and custom likely stood before insurance and law. Guilds may have smoothed loss for members. Brokers may have extracted hard terms from stranded crews. The spread between the price at the quay and the reward at the cook fire is a moral as much as a metric question, and the evidence is scattered, contracts in fragment, balances in passing remarks, rare caches of sealed tablets that name only the powerful. Linking those papers to kitchen middens and harbor cores could tighten the mesh. A port rich in spice residues and busy mud layers, but thin in local prosperity, suggests profits floating past more than settling. Plants and animals complicate the calendar. The lines of banana and coconut, of chicken and rat, arc across water, but the exact tempo of their arrival by coast and by century is still being tuned. First appearance is not the same as adoption. A single phytolith or seed can be an outlier, a trial, a gift that failed to root. What we want are thresholds, the moments when recipes change and markets expect a thing to be there. Those thresholds are visible only when many small finds align. Seeds and starch in kitchen floors, lipids in pots, isotopes in human bone that signal dietary shifts, and harbor cores that thicken with population and cooking waste at the same time. Until those convergences multiply across sites, the story will stay modeled, clear in some places, dappled in others, missing in a few where shorelines took the archive away. Climate adds a moving frame. The monsoon is reliable, but not metronomic. Years of generosity and years of stinginess punctuate centuries, and longer swings, linked to Indian Ocean dipole phases or broader patterns, may have narrowed or widened sailing windows enough to alter routes, waiting times, and risk. Tying specific crossings to specific anomalies is hard without dense anchors. Coral and speleothem records can resolve wet and dry seasons with high precision. Port cores can echo those pulses in grain size and chemistry. Tree rings far from the coast can register the same shifts in a different key. Aligning these records with routes and cargo lists asks for tight dating and a willingness to accept that some decades were offbeat and that cuisines and beliefs might have adjusted on the scale of a single generation's memory. Harbors themselves are puzzles of patience. Rivers move mouths, bars grow and fade. Towns slide upriver or down coast to meet a safer channel. Assigning ancient names with confidence to specific modern ruins remains delicate, especially where later builders reuse stone and where dredging and storm have twice moved the locks on the library. Multi-beam maps, sub-bottom echoes, and cores that clock human thickening are generous, but a single right angle under silt is not a city, and a single mound is not a quay. The fix here is convergence without haste, geomorphology that fits a harbor's logic, ceramics that match expected trade, inscriptions with place cues, and layered dates that keep time without strain. Where any one line sings alone, we note it and wait for a choir. Onboard cuisine hides in soot. Fire at sea had to be contained. Sandboxes, braziers, or simple covered pits on stone-lined hearths each leave different signatures. The vessels that fed crews might be thin and plain, easy to miss and dismiss among grander cargo jars. Lipids and soot chemistry can speak, but they need secure contexts. A galley's dump, a hearth's ash sealed by a repair layer, residues that cohere across several pots rather than a single flattering spectrum. Until such contexts increase, the flavors of the voyage will be reconstructed from analogies and fragments, honest but soft around the edges. Health and hazard at sea live in the margins. Salt, sun, and short sleep. Scurvy, where fresh food ran out. Infections in close quarters. Injuries mended with skill, and herbs known to coastal healers. These are stories that dental calculus, bone lesions, and parasite eggs in latrine layers could tell. But much of that evidence lies in graves and cesspits that are today sacred or within living neighborhoods. Method must follow ethics, or the story is not worth telling. Non-invasive mapping, sampling secondary contexts like drains and dumps, and working with community priorities will determine how quickly this fog thins. What could resolve these uncertainties gently and well? A short, careful list fits in the pocket. Isotopes in human enamel and dentine, strontium, oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, and, in special cases, lead, can separate childhood origin from adult diet, tracing movement without needing names, if and only if communities' consent and contexts are secure. Dental calculus holds micro-remains, starches, phytoliths, proteins, that reveal meals and medicines. Minimally destructive protocols can read those archives with respect. Commensal genomes in rats and chickens, sampled broadly and dated carefully, can sharpen route maps and tempos. Lipid residues in clearly shipboard vessels, paired with soot chemistry and micro-charcoal, can fix menus under sail. Harbor cores, multiplied and modeled, can place busy decades in order and tie them to climate proxies and to inscriptions that name guilds and winds. Epigraphy expanded downward, graffiti, potter's marks, scratched names in warehouses, can add the hands and voices grand steles omit. Timber provenancing, stable isotopes, and trace elements in planks and masts can tell where a hull was grown, linking shipyards to forests and, by extension, to labor and law. Each of these lines is small on its own. Braided, they grow strong. An ethical note belongs close to the heart of this part. Burial grounds and sacred precincts are not simply data stores. They are places of love, obligation, and ongoing practice. The right to say no to sampling is absolute. Where yes is possible, consent must be informed, repeatable, and paired with care. Transparent plans, local training and jobs, co-authorship that reflects labor and stewardship, and data sovereignty that keeps communities as custodians rather than as silent sources. Even in middens and harbors, restraint is wise. Take only what is needed, and leave a site richer in knowledge and relationship than it was found. Finally, a humility that is also hope. Some questions may never resolve to the comfort of a table and a tidy date. The sea erases as much as it preserves. Storms and builders remake shorelines and archives. But the past decade's methods have already taken suppositions and made them sturdier, turning spice lore into spectra, turning stowaway guesses into haplogroups, turning harbor legends into layered cores that keep time. If the winds taught anything to those who lived by them, it was to trust a rhythm and to work within it. The work here is the same, small, steady, and honest about weather. Breathe in the quiet of the uncertainties room one more time. The questions are not threats, they are invitations. Each one points to a shore where a careful landing might add a fact to a feeling, a name to a habit, a date to a taste. The ocean story is already big enough to hold what we do not yet know, and kind enough to reward those who say so plainly. In the next part, we'll step back onto the decks and into the alleys for crew, labor, life. An everyday portrait of work and rest across seasons, drawn from tools, kitchens, contracts, and the soft evidence of repeated gestures. Let morning begin with the small sounds of readiness. A ladle tapping a clay rim in the galley corner, a whetstone's soft scrape, a murmur at the bow where two hands test a line and feel whether the night's damp has stiffened the fibers or left them supple again. Life aboard is not grand gesture, but practiced sequence, and each body knows its part the way the tide knows its slope. Someone stirs a pot that smells of onion and salt fish. Someone else coils a rope in a flat spiral that will run out clean when called. Someone checks the stitching where the seam met hard wind last week and trims a loose end before it can turn into trouble. Watches divide the day into duty and rest, but rest is not sleep so much as readiness at a lower volume. On deck, the helmsman keeps a hand on a tiller that talks through wood, the way a friend's shoulder can telegraph mood. A pilot watches the long swell set and the cat's paw ruffle where the breeze strengthens. A pair works the sheets with an ease that looks like laziness until a gust climbs and their movements tighten to a ballet of small corrections. Below or under a shade, a sailmaker mends by light, his palm leathered where the needlehead pushes. A carpenter checks a seam with a thin knife and the back of a nail, listening for the note that says the wood is still content. Food is a clock layered under the other clocks. Breakfast is what the sea allows. Flatbread warmed on a small griddle set in sand, a spoon of lentils that thickened overnight, a pinch of spice kept back for mornings when a hard night needs softening. Fresh things vanish first. Sprouts are coaxed from soaked pulses for green. Pickles and dried fish carry memory and minerals when the mouth is bored and the body is low. A good cook is part nurse, part quartermaster, part psalmist. The pot is a drum that keeps morale in time, and the right steam at the right hour can turn silence back into conversation. Hierarchy exists, but it breathes. A captain carries responsibility like a weight that only he can feel. A pilot carries routes in his head, a landscape of water learned in seasons of caution, and a few nights of fear. A bosun knows who can be trusted in a squall and who needs a hand on the shoulder before a job. Apprentices learn by proximity, running errands that look small and are, in fact, the curriculum of competence. Bring that line, not the other. Mind your fingers at the block. Listen to the way this knot tightens and how this other one slips free. Titles matter in contracts. On deck, it is habits that save. Languages mingle into a practical music. Orders are short and mostly nouns and verbs without prepositions. Warnings are shouted in whatever syllables come fastest. Jokes and curses travel quickest. Then prayers, then recipes. In harbors, the ship speaks many tongues through many mouths. The trader's careful numbers, the pilot's weather, the cook's provisioning, the carpenter's shopping for pitch and fibers and a plank of the right density. A child can learn 3 ways to say fresh water in a week just by running between market, quay, and well. Women's work in this world is visible in the lanes and, in some seasons and crews, on deck too. In port, women lend and tally, cure and pickle, manage the long wait while winds think. They run stalls that become information exchanges as much as markets, where gossip is intelligence, whose bar is shoaling, which headman is generous this year, which guild has relaxed its rule on strangers. On some boats and some coasts, a cook or a healer or a trader rides with family. On others, gendered divisions are strict and the deck is male space by rule and habit. What is constant is the thread of care that makes voyages possible. The preserved foods made well before departure, the clothing mended to last, the mats and ropes woven during the waiting months, so the boat can be ready when the first reliable breeze returns. Credit and obligation knot together like twine. A voyage is financed by promises, pepper to be delivered, ivory to be paid, cloth to be carried, a cut of profits to this shrine, a gift to that patron. Small loans oil the joints of the system. An advance for rice, another for resin, a tab at the potter's booth to replace a cracked water jar. When the ship comes home with a hold that smells of spice and dried goods and tar, accounts are settled with coins and sacks and meals and favors, and the calendar breathes out. When sea or luck runs thin and a return is poor, patience and reputation carry the day. The lender who trusts the captain's next window, the guild that eases terms for crews known to pay. The shrine that accepts a smaller lamp and a larger vow. Repair is the shadow of risk and the measure of skill. On a clean strand at neap tide, the hull is laid over, propped, and scraped. Barnacles pop and roll. Weed comes away in plates. Under the skin, the wood looks like breath held and then released. Pitch warms in a pot that smells like a faraway forest and is worked into seams that run like the seams of a palm. Each line a life of swelling and shrinking, strain and ease. A good repair day ends with hands sticky and happy, a hull that feels younger by a season, and a small feast to mark that the boat will go to sea with more confidence than it woke with. Waiting in port is its own labor. Nets are knotted and dried, lines are relaid, sails are patched, stories are traded. Contracts are argued and then softened, by tea and by a sweet. Children chase each other under lintels carved with patient geometry. Elders recite verse or law. An itinerant singer earns food and coin for a ballad that names a headland and a storm with the right adjectives. Guilds meet. Pilots compare notes on bars and beacons. A magistrate settles a dispute with a sentence that aligns with winds and with dignity, so that all can walk away without losing face and with a schedule that does not insult the season. Illness is managed by routine and herb. Sun and salt tire, heat and damp breed trouble. Small wounds fester under rope fibers if not minded. A deck box holds simple medicines. Ginger for stomachs that argue with the swell, clove and cinnamon in cloth sachets for smell and for small antiseptics, limes or tamarind where purses and parity allow, ointments that smell of resin and smoke, rubbed into tendon and skin at day's end. When serious illness comes, fever that shines in the eye, a deep cut that grins red, neighbors lean in, a healer from the lane, a prayer from a friend, an oil that someone's grandmother swore by and that sometimes is real help. Ritual marks thresholds, so labor feels part of a larger thing. Before a departure, a lamp is lit, or a verse said, or a hand laid flat on a hull and kept there a long breath. At safe arrival, a coin is given, a pot of sweets goes to neighbors, a palm frond is tied at a doorframe. These acts are small and quick, but they teach crews and families that risk is held and shared, and they give the work a shape that is larger than the day's tasks. All the while, the monsoon schedule hums underfoot. In the weeks before a window, energy rises, jobs are finished, lists are checked, tempers shorten, and then, perhaps because of that, hands get quicker at apology and repair. In the weeks after arrival, everything slackens into the long chores of upkeep and social life. Weddings, naming days, festivals postponed for the sea. The year divides cleanly: go and come, wait and mend, plant and harvest, travel and tell. If there is a single picture that holds this part, imagine evening on a deck when the boat is still, a pot cooling under a cloth, a coil of rope that lies like a sleeping animal, tools in a neat row, a small lantern lit near the stern, voices low and unhurried, someone humming without knowing, the water slapping softly against a plank that was a tree once and is now a home that moves. Labor has its music and its rests, and crews learn both by heart. Ethical care, even in this portrait, matters. Much of what could sharpen it, names from graves, details from family archives, memories held by communities whose ancestors kept these routes, belongs first to those who keep them now. Any telling worth trusting is one that listens where invited, shares credit and results, and understands that a life at sea is not a museum piece, but a lineage still afloat along many coasts. In the next part, we'll return to methods and evidence too, doubling back with fresh eyes to isotopes, epigraphy, harbor cores, and commensal genomes, to see how new data sets refine routes, tempos, and the human textures of this ocean's long exchange. Return, unhurried, to the toolkit, same careful rooms, same patient instruments, but look from a different angle, because second passes often turn hints into roots and textures into timelines that feel truer under the fingers. This time, the focus narrows to 4 threads that braid especially well: isotopes that map origins and diets, epigraphy that names people, winds, and guilds, harbor cores that register not just presence but pulse, and commensal genomes that sketch stowaway paths with unexpected clarity. Each on its own is a low voice. Together they become a chorus that guides without shouting. Begin with isotopes, the quiet arithmetic of place and food, written into enamel and bone. Enamel forms in childhood and keeps a mineral memory of where water and dust came from in those years. Bone remodels and so remembers the more recent diet of adult life. Strontium ratios trace the bedrock that weathered into soil and into food. Oxygen ratios echo the rain in rivers that filled jars and mouths. Carbon and nitrogen sketch the balance between marine and terrestrial foods and between different kinds of plants. A pilot buried in a port cemetery, if sampling is welcomed and contexts are secure, might show childhood strontium from a far hinterland and adult oxygen aligned to coastal water, a life arc that left a home valley for a harbor street and a deck. A goat jaw from a market layer can reverse the story: childhood inland, slaughter at the coast, marking the reach of provisioning networks that fed ships and towns. Patterns across many individuals and species draw maps with edges that match the monsoon's workable lanes. Isotopes are only clear when grounded. Baselines, so-called isoscapes, have to be mapped with care, because the same ratio can occur in 2 regions that share geology or rainfall. The remedy is twofold: pair elements, strontium with oxygen, carbon with nitrogen, to reduce coincidence, and expand the local reference set with plants, waters, and small animals that never travel far. Precision improves when enamel is sampled along growth lines, childhood, adolescence, rather than as a single blend. In some cases, lead isotopes add a bonus signature where metallurgical traditions differ. In others, sulfur helps separate fish from field and coastal diets that blur categories. The point is never one number. It is the pattern that settles when many numbers, measured honestly and modeled with transparency, begin to agree. Turn to epigraphy, words in stone, metal, and mind. Inscriptions near quays and market mosques, on temple lintels and warehouse thresholds, record donors and debts, wins and weeks, the names of ships and guilds, and the places they call home. A copperplate grants tax relief to spice traders for a defined season, naming months that align with sailing windows. A stele at a coastal shrine thanks a god for a safe crossing and lists the captain's guild and the port of origin. Every word a data point that can be weighed against ceramic fabrics and harbor cores. Shorter marks, the potter's stamp, the scratched name on a store jar, the tally on a plaster wall, are humbler but often closer to daily life, pulling the gaze away from courts and toward kitchens and quays. Reading is only half the work. Context is the other half. Many inscriptions are reused in later walls. Some travel as prized stone long after the building that first hosted them fell. A good record notes where a text was found, in which layer, how it faced, what sat bejeweled it. Paleography, the study of letter shapes, can tighten dates, but it too needs calibration against objects that can be dated absolutely by independent means. Crossfits are the joy, when an inscription that names a merchant guild appears in layers whose harbor mud thickened with life in the same centuries, and when nearby sherds carry lipid signatures of spices that guild likely traded, then the line between text and mud becomes a bridge rather than a guess. Harbor cores, revisited, become metronomes. The first pass told us silt stacks keep time. The second pass listens for rhythm and syncopation. Grain-sized spectra swing between monsoon calm and storm pulse. Charcoal tallies, kitchens and kilns. Biomarkers whisper ship repair and spice use. Fecal sterols trace population density close to the basin. Stack multiple cores from different points in a harbor. River mouth, old quay, back channel, and patterns sharpen. Peaks that appear across all cores signal basin-wide busyness. Peaks that show only near a repaired quay suggest local dredging or a market shift. Bayesian age depth models, updated as new dates arrive, let cores from different harbors speak to one another like synchronized clocks, aligning busy decades across coasts. Sometimes the cores disagree a little. Those dissonances are helpful, pointing to local quirks, an eddy that trapped silt, a side channel that kept its own time, a storm that tore one flank of a port and spared another. Commensal genomes, the unheralded archives in rat and chicken, and, now and then, cat and dog, trace the human web through the bodies that learn to live with us. Mitochondrial haplogroups draw the broad lines. Nuclear markers add detail. When dated layers hold bones that yield sequences with ancient damage patterns, roots sharpen to lanes. A black rat lineage stepping in time from South Asia to East Africa argues for a steady, repeated crossing along southwest winds and a return by northeast breath. A chicken lineage with Southeast Asian roots appearing in western port layers in the early first millennium CE adds another strand to the same rope. When those genomes co-occur with shifts in kitchen residues, coconut and clove appearing where they were absent before, the case that life and taste move together becomes more than anecdote. Newer methods deepen each thread without changing the quiet tone. Proteomics in dental calculus can distinguish animal milks where lipids falter and can confirm spices when DNA fails. Compound-specific isotope analysis refines the identity of aromatics that share mass spectra. Micro-CT scanning of fragile artifacts lets residues be sampled with surgical precision and without shattering context. And ancient RNA, rare but real in exceptional preservation, has begun, in a few cases, to hint at plant and microbial presence where DNA broke entirely. None of these are miracles. All are scaffolds that let careful questions be asked with a little more confidence. Limits deserve repeating, because repetition is how respect sets. Isotopic overlap can mislead. Commensal genomes can be contaminated by modern cousins. Inscriptions can be out of place. Cores can be bioturbated by creatures that stir mud into false continuity. Lipids can be equifinal, different ingredients, similar peaks. Good practice pairs methods, publishes raw data, and invites reanalysis. Better practice adds local co-authors and co-directors who know the coast beyond the lab's radius, so that sampling and interpretation match lived knowledge. Best practice accepts that some contexts, burial grounds, active shrines, revered ruins, are not for drills or vials, and that understanding can wait for a gentler path or a different proxy. An uncertainty box, placed softly here, keeps us honest about the human side of methods. Crew composition and labor organization remain underlit. Isotopes from teeth could help, but only if communities invite that work. Epigraphy is eloquent, but it names donors more often than deckhands. Graffiti and small marks can balance that, if we look where people lived and worked, not only where they prayed and paid. Commensal genomes are powerful, yet they follow us imperfectly. Local extinctions and later introductions blur signals unless sequences map a broad time grid. Cores tell pulse, not motive. A thickened layer is busy, but why? Storm repairs, trade booms, pilgrim swells, needs triangulation with text and artifact. Wabe now, again, in brief. Instruments have reached sensitivities that let parts per billion become utterances. Reference libraries have grown from a few exemplary spectra and genomes to many regionally tuned atlases. And open datasets allow one harbor's mud to be compared fairly with another's, one lab's spectra to be checked against a second's. The field's center of gravity has shifted from singular claims to convergences that can carry weight without strain. Hold for a moment. A composite scene that a second-pass toolkit can now draw. A port's mud shows a mid-first millennium thickening. Its cores carry tar signatures and faint aromatic peaks. Sherds from the same levels whisper coconut and clove. Rat bones yield matrilines that point east and then west. A lintel inscription names a guild that rode the winds in those decades and gave thanks near this very quay. Enamel from a goat jaw shows inland fields and coastal slaughter. Enamel from a sailor, sampled with consent in a protected study, shows childhood far away and adulthood by the sea. Each line is modest. Together, they are a route, a routine, a week in a life. Ethical note, one more time, because it frames everything. Destructive sampling at tiny scales is still destruction. Permissions and priorities must come first. Co-authorship and data sovereignty are not courtesies but conditions. And some answers, especially those that would require touching the dead or the sacred without full communal accord, are better left as questions until the path is right. The ocean teaches patience as skill, not just as virtue. Set the instruments aside. The sea outside the lab still smells of tide and resin. The market still wakes in the same sequence. The winds will turn on time. The methods only matter because they let those rhythms be heard more clearly and more humbly, turning legend into layered evidence and anchoring taste and belief to roots that can be traced without flattening lives. In the next part, we'll sink a core into spices and sediment, following echoes of clove, cinnamon, pepper, and coconut as they settle into harbor mud, and seeing how those faint traces can time the spread of flavors across coasts. Picture a harbor at slack water, the tide holding its breath. The town around it cooks lunch, fires lit, pots on, and the air is a low tapestry of scent, smoke, salt, a thread of sweetness from a vendor's pan, and, now and then, the bright lift of spice set to bloom in oil. A breeze presses those molecules down to the water, where they meet dust from sacks shouldered along the quay and small rinsings from decks and hands. Bit by bit, everything that lives in the port's breath becomes part of the harbor's skin. When the tide turns, some scents skate away, others settle in the mud and wait with the patience of clay. Centuries later, a slim core pulls up those layers like pages, and spices, never as whole buds or sticks, almost never as seeds, return as faint chemical signatures, the breath of a town trapped, then red. The molecules that tell these stories are modest and stubborn. They are not the same as the bright personalities a cook knows. The kitchen's top notes brown, burn, and break, trading drama for durability. What remains are longer chains and sturdier rings, lipid residues from coconut and oil seeds, resin acids from tree saps used to seal jars and seams, and, for certain spices, metabolites and heavier aromatic fragments that can survive heat, time, and silt. Clove's eugenol, so vivid when ground, rarely keeps its full voice, yet a family of related phenolics can flag its presence when found together. Cinnamon's cinnamaldehyde reshapes under heat, but its downstream cousins, cinnamic acid derivatives, can linger. Pepper's piperine is fragile in the open, and more often retold by the company it kept. Oils and waxes in a pattern that, layered with other evidence, makes a pepper-shaped shadow plausible. Reading mud is choreography. Each centimeter, sliced from the core, is bagged, labeled, and split in purpose. One part heads for grain size analysis, the quiet sorting of silt and sand that separates monsoon calm from storm event. One part dries for loss on ignition, a proxy for how much life the layer held. One part dissolves into solvents that coax out lipids and aromatics. The resulting solutions, earth-tinted, faintly fragrant only to machines, run through instruments that separate and weigh molecules with time and voltage, producing forested skylines of peaks. No single peak is a victory, patterns are. A cluster in one layer means little, That same cluster, repeating across adjacent layers that date to decades when other lines say the harbor was busy, becomes an argument that connects breadth to basin. Sediment does not keep a perfect diary. Burrowing creatures mix the upper layers, softening edges, storms smear. That is why multiple cores, taken across a port's floor, near an old quay in a back channel, at a river mouth, matter. When a spice pattern appears across these stations in the same date window, confidence rises. When it appears only near the quay, the story narrows to kitchens and workshops right at the water's edge, a local habit rather than a citywide taste. Sometimes a core will show a spike of resin acids without a matching bump in kitchen fats. More ship repair than cooking. Elsewhere, kitchen fats thicken while pitch remains low, more households than hulls in those years. The harbor becomes an instrument, played by labor and weather, that a careful ear can tune. Not all harbors sing the same songs. Along estuarine coasts, river silt dilutes signals, and only years of aggregated calm bring spice patterns above the baseline. In reef-sheltered lagoons, fine mud settles gently and records smaller shifts in town life. In rocky roadsteads where ships anchor off and lighter craft ferry goods ashore, the basin might hold more tar than taste, the proof of patching over the smell of stews. Ports that shifted with rivers leave split melodies. The old channel's mud tells one century's recipe. The new cut, a generation later, builds a second chorus a short walk away. With maps and dates aligned, the two can be read as a single wandering kitchen. Context is the difference between romance and result. A hint of clove-like phenolics in mud means more when nearby sherds carry the same family of signatures inside their pores, and more still when inscriptions or letters from the same strata mention debts in sacks of spice, or guilds whose names are tied to that trade. Coconut waxes and sediment sing louder when pots from the same layers show heated lipid ratios that look like stew finished with coconut milk. The goal is never to make mud do more than it can. The goal is to let it harmonize with pots, texts, and bones until a port's breath becomes legible. Caution keeps the story honest. Many plants share biochemical pathways. A compound that feels like cinnamon could, in isolation, be something else entirely. That is why analysts avoid single-name declarations when the peaks are few or faint, and prefer multi-compound bundles with the right proportions and neighbors. Heat damage matters. Burned layers can create new molecules that mimic others, as sugars and proteins dance into Maillard byproducts that complicate spectra. Contamination is not just a lab hazard. Modern runoff can seed upper centimeters with today's cuisine. Careful removal of the cap, clean benches, and parallel blanks with every batch are as much storytelling as they are protocol. When it works, though, a harbor's mud reads like a festival poster. In one port, a long quiet, then a swelling of kitchen signal, more fats, more charcoal, matched by the first consistent appearance of an aromatic bundle that could only be clove and cinnamon together. A decade later, a tar pulse joins, the sign that repairs and refits increased, perhaps because more ships stayed through the season. In another, coconuts' waxes run steady across centuries, groves at the edge of town, a cuisine that leaned into the palm, while short, sharp spikes of other aromatics mark feast years tied to pilgrim flows. In a third, a sudden thinning, a layer almost clean, tells of a flood that flushed the basin, resetting the archive. After it, the city's taste returns, but altered, perhaps by new markets upriver or a bar that shifted the main quay down coast. There is grace in admitting what mud cannot tell. It cannot reveal the hand that stirred the pot, the hierarchy of taste inside a household, the argument at a stall that set a price high or low. It can hint at scale and pulse, not at motive and meaning. For those, voices and stones and habits help. A scratched recipe on a wall, a cooking hearth arranged just so, a loan document pegged to a wind that turns next week. Sediment is one witness among many. Its strength is its indifference. It does not flatter. It remembers without preference. If this feels like a quiet revolution, it is because it is built of many small, careful tolerances rather than a single announcement. 20 years ago, the thought that a core could carry spice across centuries would have sounded like wishful poetry. Now, with reference libraries tuned to regions and with models that treat dates as curves rather than pins on a line, spice and sediment is a tool that can be picked up without apology. The danger is overreach, the cure is companionship, never letting mud speak alone when pots and texts and bones can join. An ethical note belongs even here. Harbors are often edged by graves and shrines. Khors should avoid sacred precincts unless invited, and even then with rituals of respect as much as with permits. Fisherfolk and boatmen still working those waters can say where silt runs and where it eddies. Their knowledge protects both the present and the past. Sharing results back, in language that makes sense on a jetty at dawn, turns chemistry into community rather than into a paper that never leaves a shelf. At the end of the day, a harbor core, split and bagged, looks unromantic, brown smears and labeled envelopes. But laid in order and asked the right questions, those smears become a time lapse of appetite. The earliest pepper in a town might be a rumor in mud. The moment a dish becomes daily, the sediment's chemistry grows confident. When a city loses taste, by plague, by politics, by river shift, the mud goes thin and clean, and that absence is a story too. Let the tide breathe again. The town cooks supper as lamps are lit. Spice lifts and drops. A child sneezes at the pepper in the air, and then laughs. The basin takes what it is given, a little each day, and keeps it. Centuries later, a narrow tube returns that generosity by letting a careful hand read the taste of lives. In the next part, we'll take up myth versus evidence too, revisiting cherished sea tales in light of these quieter archives, and seeing where the latest signals ask the oldest stories to soften or to shine. Set a low lamp on the table and lay out the stories that keep returning to docksides and classrooms. Tempting, tidy, and just a little too sharp at the edges to match the way coastlines actually behave. Then place, beside each story, what patient layers and small measurements ask us to consider instead. No drama here, only the calm of a tide that sorts sand and shell until the shapes make sense. Myth. A single brave navigator discovered the monsoon and unlocked the ocean. The legend loves a hinge moment. One person, one winter, one insight, and suddenly sails point outward. Evidence prefers longer arcs. Coastal farmers and fishers knew seasonal reversals in their bones long before any long-haul pilot inked a guide. What changes in early texts is not knowledge of wind, but scale and confidence. Coasting chains tighten into longer crossings. Notes about headlands and stars bloom into itineraries that assume return on schedule. The hero story shrinks gently into a chorus, pilots adding increments, ports building calendars, families learning to wait well, until routine, not revelation, is the engine. Myth. One golden port gathered the world, then vanished in a single storm. It is consoling to name a city as a capital of currents and to imagine it swallowed whole by fate. Shorelines are less theatrical. Rivers slide their mouths. Bars grow and thin. Quays migrate down a bend, then another. Harbor cores show thickened human layers during busy centuries. Thinned layers when roots or mouths changed. Storm horizons as charcoal slivers rather than apocalyptic gulfs. Stone from proud buildings reappears in humbler walls. Towns shift like hands along a rope. Same grip, new position. Disappearance is, more often, drift. Myth. Spices leapt from grove to court as royal miracles. One peppercorn for a king, one clove for an emperor, and fame moved with them. Spectacle is real, and elite contexts matter, but cuisines change by repetition. The sturdy signal arrives not in a single glittering find, but in a braid. Residues in ordinary pots, charred seeds in middens, dated well. Harbor mud that captures a port's breath over decades. Contracts pegged to seasons and sacks. And, later, steady mentions in recipe-like notes. A city that pinches pepper once is thrilled. A city that pinches it every winter is changed. Myth. Ships were cultural capsules. Single language, single faith, sealed crews under a unitary flag. Texts, written by elites, sometimes make it seem so, because authors saw what looked like them. Logistics suggest porosity. Hazardous capes required local pilots. Markets required translators and brokers. Months of waiting built mixed neighborhoods. Kitchens borrowed quickly. Crew lists, where they survive, are thin. Burials at ports are disturbed or ethically off-limits. Even so, the weave peeks through. Multilingual orders on deck, repairs using terms from several craft lineages, and dockside shrines marked by gifts from far and near. Capsules melt into caravans of practice. Myth. Austronesian voyagers planted bananas across Africa in a single wave and at a single date. Then cuisines reshaped overnight. The tidy line is appealing. The record is modeled. Banana and plantain arrive by steps, not leaps. phytoliths and starch ghosts in some places early, char and names in others later, adoption curves that differ by river, coast, and climate. Thresholds, not firsts, matter most. When pots begin to carry coconut and banana signatures often. When harbor mud thickens with kitchen fats in the same decades. When bone isotopes and people shift diets enough to mark a new staple as normal, not novel. The timeline becomes a gradient, not a wall. Myth. The Silk Road explains the sea. It is a useful metaphor that can flatten the ocean into a single path with a single purpose. The Indian Ocean is better understood as seasonal circuits braided together. Arabian, Red Sea, Malabar, Sri Lankan, Bay of Bengal, Malacca, each with its own pulses and fallback routes, all synchronized by winds, not by a central command. Ports are intertidal, places of mixing, waiting, and moving, more like estuaries than highways. The sea's logic is a calendar and a repertoire, not a road. Myth. Indian Ocean trade was forever peaceful and cosmopolitan by nature. Monsoon diplomacy made conflict a stranger. The long quiet is real and deserves respect. Predictability rewards patience. And port cities learned that trust is the cheapest insurance. Still, coercion sits alongside hospitality. Fortified headlands, guild monopolies, customs with teeth, burned layers in a few harbors that speak of punctuated violence. The better story honors the norm of accommodation, without pretending exceptions did not matter to those who experienced them. Myth. Grand fleets remade everything at once. Big vessels and big courts, on all coasts, leave loud records and invite us to hang centuries on a handful of expeditions. But kitchens and quays run on smaller boats, built and mended at steady speed, and on families whose risk calculus is local. Even in decades when courts reach for sea power, harbor cores and pot pours record continuity more than rupture. The stew still finishes with coconut, the pilot still watches the sky by color at dawn, the market still wakes in the same sequence. Power can redirect routes. Taste and practice often remain rhythm first, decree second. Myth. A single site proves a network. One amphora, one inscription, one aromatic peak in a residue, and a line is drawn, a map inked. Evidence asks for more neighbors. Vessel fabrics and forms must fit known workshops and eras. Text must be in place and context. Chemistry must be a chorus, not a solo. The standard of care is convergence. Mud pulse with kitchen fats and pitch, residues that repeat across sherds and secure layers, texts that mention guilds and months that match sailing windows, and, if we are lucky, commensal genomes that draw routes in rat and chicken. Lines drawn without company feel fast. Lines braided across methods feel earned. Myth. All knowledge in this basin flowed from a single source, a civilizational center that taught, while others received. Winds make teacher and student into unhelpful roles. Techniques and tastes moved both ways. Rope splices, hull seams, spice blends, contract forms, shrine dedications, fast day menus. A port's virtue is reciprocity. Its structure is exchange. A fairer story speaks of many centers, seasonal and shifting, arguing, borrowing, and blending under the same predictable sky. A few careful recalibrations belong to specific pet claims. The urge to anchor a famous ancient name to a modern mound is strong. The ethical fix is patience. Rivers relocate ports, later builders reuse stone, dredging erases edges. Let geomorphology, ceramics, cores, and inscriptions agree before a label is fixed. Likewise, a single constellation of spice markers in a single pot is a pleasant surprise. A dozen such constellations across a layer make a cuisine. And the most stubborn question, who exactly made these crossings work, still asks for quiet methods and consent. Isotopes and dental calculus where communities invite, graffiti and small dedications read with the same attention we once reserved for grand steles. Ethical note, many cherished stories are also living identity. Local pride tied to a quay, a shrine, a recipe. Revision should be companionship, not conquest. Where legend and layer align, let joy be shared. Where they diverge, offer additions, not erasures, and follow the lead of those who keep the places and the practices. Some contexts, graves under coconut shade, sacred rooms, are not for sampling. Knowing when to leave a good mystery alone is part of good method. Under lamplight, the myths do not disappear, they soften. What remains is more human, schedules learned and kept, risks shared, meals repeated until they tasted like home, even when home was a season away. The ocean looks less like a theater for heroes and more like a school for patience, where wind and mud, timber and tar, prayer and pepper, and the small arithmetic of trust produce a world sown by habit. Lift the lamp, listen to the water tapping the key, and let the corrected stories find their seats among the proven ones. It is a quieter haul, but the conversations last longer. In the next part, we'll begin closing the loop, following one full year in the life of a single port en route circuit, from harvest and fitting out to departure, waiting season, return, and the way those cycles rewrote taste and thought across generations. Let's slow walk a year, one gentle circuit from hillside to harbor, from sail to stall, from waiting season to return. Because an ocean made of wind is also a calendar made of hands, and tracing one loop lets the whole network breathe into view. Harvest starts far from the quay, while the last rains still lace the mornings. In the western Ghats, pepper vines cling to living poles, and pickers move in the green dim with baskets at their hips. Drupes shift from firm green to a blush that reads like readiness to trained eyes. Harvesters take them just shy of full ripeness so they'll dry into beads that keep their heat and perfume. In coconut belts along the coast, climbers shimmy up trunks at dawn when air and toddy are coolest. In backwater polders, rice heads nod heavy over brackish canals that will carry sacks outward. All of this follows a rhythm older than the present town. Cut and carry, sort and blanch, spread on mats, watch for mold, turn at noon, pull in before evening damp. The monsoon is a presence even in its quieter shoulder. It tells everyone how long they can count on the sun holding a steady heat on a wide courtyard floor. Downstream, the river gathers a soft flotilla of shallow boats, bumping together in the shade of mangroves. Bundles arrive at go-downs, where ledgers wait and scales find their balance. Pepper moves in measured sacks, coconut in nuts and oil, rice by weight and by favor. Men and women keep tallies with stylus and abacus, but conversation carries the true calculation. A guild credit rolled over, a cousin vouching for a delayed delivery, an interest rate tied to a wind that, if it turns on time, will make everyone look wise. The quay smells of wet rope, husk, and tar, and the season's first rumor floats through the lanes like the lightest smoke. The breeze in the channel tipped yesterday for the first time. Barely, but enough to make pilots lift their heads and smile. Fitting out days are choreography. The hull's underside, scraped clean on the beach and sealed with pitch, takes on gloss in the morning sun. Choir seams hum under a thumb's press. The mast gets a second look from a carpenter whose eye measures truth to a hair. On the sand, sails are laid out like patient wings. Mends are made where last season's gusts tugged hardest. Reefing points are retied by a hand that knows knots, not by name, but by how they release after they have saved lives. Provisions arrive in an order that wisdom settled long ago. Jars of fresh water first, checked and sealed, then durable starches, then legumes, dried fish and pickles to keep courage on the tongue, spices tucked small and is safe, more for morale than trade, and last, fresh goods that will turn diet into meals during the first week when everyone remembers land. Departure day is not loud, it is clean. The boat's shadow slides along the quay as lines are eased. A pilot checks the color seam where sky lies on water. Someone at the bow sings a line under the breath, habit more than prayer. And the hull gathers a gentle tremor that is the difference between being tied and being free. The wind this month is a teacher, not a test. It comes from the expected quarter with a steadiness that makes seamanship look effortless. Coasting legs string together like a rosary of capes and coves. Then a longer reach, when confidence and current agree, puts open water all around and the sky's bowl becomes the only horizon anyone needs. Watches are set in a pattern the crew can keep in darkness without thinking. Stand, sleep, mend, cook, tell, listen, repeat. The sea's middle is where the calendar feels like weather rather than a page. Swell keeps time underfoot. Cloud stacks and dissolves without promise. Birds decide to visit or not. Work is small and constant. Check lashings. Wet the deck where the sun runs too hard. Rub oil into a line that feels dry. Trade an hour of sleep for a longer story from the pilot about a headland that will be only a shadow in haze when it shows at last. Meals anchor, predictably, a bowl and a shared silence. A joke cracked when the pot's lid lifts and someone smells a spice saved for today. a cup of toddy or tea that tastes for a heartbeat, like a courtyard at home. Fear, when it arrives, is respected and then folded back into practice. Reef early, run if you must, heave to if running would be bravado rather than prudence. Nothing is hurried unless prudence demands it, and then even hurry has a shape that keeps hands from tangling. Landfall is a rumor first. The water's color changes a thin degree. A flock lifts and then veers. The air carries a leaf smell instead of blank salt. Then a smudge becomes a line, becomes a headland, and the boat's talk with swell changes key as depth shallows and the pilot's memory reaches for soundings. Mud where it should be mud, sand where it should be sand, shell where a bar sometimes bites too close to comfort at this tide. A harbor is never a surprise to those who keep it. To those arriving on schedule, it is a confirmation and a relief. Lines go ashore, made fast by hands that know this knot too, and the first errands run themselves. Water, news, a quick visit to the office where credits and customs meet, a nod to the shrine that keeps watch over the quay. The waiting season is the true texture of exchange. Space in a go-down turns into a small neighborhood. Sleep settles into a room where someone else's cousins already have a mat. Language becomes a stew of borrowed words, gestures, and food names that need no translation. Kitchens teach as surely as maps. How to grate coconut without bleeding knuckles. When to add tamarind to keep a stew from sulking. Where to buy onions that will caramelize instead of collapse under heat. A carpenter learns a new mix of oil and resin that stays supple on a beam. A sailmaker tests a stitch that, on this coast, outlasts a squall by a season. A pilot hears a different word for the same cat's paw and adopts it because it fits better in the mouth at speed. Contracts get refreshed with real faces, disputes soften over tea, guilds and courts set terms and then adjust them by custom in ways that let everyone save face. Children reinvent games in alleys where stone holds midday shade. Someone falls in love, someone else writes a letter that will cross later and arrive in a hand that knows the weight of wind. Belief moves in the same cadence. Lamps lit at dusk for safe return sit beside offerings for fair profit, beside a whispered thanks that a fever broke last week before it became fear. The shrine or mosque or temple feels like a harbor within a harbor. It keeps schedules of its own that, after a month, feel as inevitable as tide, and the crew learns which dates will make a quarter day slower and sweeter, which mornings call for quiet, which nights invite music into lanes. Generosity stretches across doctrine when windows narrow, and patience is the only coin that spends well. The return begins with a repetition that never grows ordinary, the first sure turn of wind from the other quarter. Shops make a sound like a single flock changing direction. Lids fall onto jars, ropes are counted, promises are tallied into a bundle the mind can hold. On the beach, the hull shows its belly for a last check. On the quay, a ledger grows new columns, purchases made, gifts packed, debts carried forward, small windfalls noted and then immediately turned into something edible, wearable, mended, or stored. Goodbyes are fast because slow ones hurt, and because crews know the sea dislikes sentiment better than it dislikes most things. The second crossing is the first one's echo, but with more stories. The pot carries a recipe learned and adapted. The carpenter guards a trick in the wrist that makes a spar sit sweet on its mortise. The pilot hums a tune picked up on a night when a courtyard smelled of jaggery and smoke and wet stone. Sleep is easier on a boat going home. Risk feels familiar. Hands find tools in the dark with more confidence. And the deck's small noises sound domestic again. A flying fish landing by mistake becomes a feast. A squall becomes a rehearsal from earlier seasons. A new rope, spun from a different fiber tried in port, earns a quiet commendation when it takes its first strain without complaint. Home harbor receives without surprise but with satisfaction. Lines catch, voices rise and then soften. The boat rides gently, as if listening to the familiar ground under its keel. In the lanes behind the quay, news outruns the crew by minutes. So-and-so came early this season, such and such price held. A cousin's child took a name on a feast day that everyone expected because it suited the family's line. Goods unpack into ledgers and then into meals, garments, repairs, and dowries. Accounts settle. A shrine gets a lamp and a handful of coins. The hull rests in shade. The year exhales. Small edits remain. A spice stays in the kitchen because it proved itself. A rope splice becomes standard because it felt right under strain. A verse joins a family's archive because it made sense under a sky that belongs to both coasts now. Over a decade, these small edits add up to a cuisine that tastes like the ocean's timetable, a legal habit that encodes season into fairness, a calendar that binds work and faith to wind without hurry or force. If a consensus wants a single lesson from the loop, it is this: sail, not oar, and schedule, not shock, did the heavy lifting. Minority views about who took which daring leaps and when remain, and they color the margins. Speculation belongs in the gaps, named as such, and treated as a placeholder for the next careful core, inscription, or pot. The ethical perimeter holds steady. Ports are homes, not just archives. Living practices deserve more than footnotes, and the best histories are the ones communities can recognize as their own, when told back to them at a pace that sounds like their mornings. Stand now at the quay at dusk, and listen to the low chorus of work, rest, and promise. The year closes, another opens, the winds will keep time, the hands will keep craft, the kitchens will keep memory, the loop holds. In the next part, we'll offer a gentle goodbye, pulling back to meaning, letting the monsoon's clock tick softly as we close, and leaving a small light on for the next curious night. Let the wind ease, let the sea go from pewter to soft slate, and the harbor take its evening breath the way a calm sleeper does, long in, longer out. Across the Indian Ocean rim, lamps are being lit, a clay cup flame in a courtyard, a lantern on a jetty, a glow in a lab where vials have been capped and notes tucked under clips. The monsoon turns on time without asking for anyone's applause. Sails nap on furled yards. Kitchens finish their last stews. Shrines hold a steady light. It is a good hour to pull back and rest in the shape of what this long journey has traced. What mattered here was simple and intricate at once. Sail, not oar. Rhythm, not force. A seasonal engine that turned the basin into a patient clock, and the ways people learned to fit life to that clock with grace, harvesting when rains softened, mending when silt settled, departing when the pressure banked from a predictable quarter and the first cat's pulse walked across the channel. The ocean's predictability became human habit, a year made of two winds, a kitchen made of many coasts, a prayer tied to the hour of tide rather than to the wish for miracles. And across 2.5 millennia, that habit rewrote diets and ideas more thoroughly than any single decree could have. Listen, a pestle slows in a mortar where pepper and salt and herbs become paste for tomorrow's first bowl. A rope creaks once as it settles on a hook, still warm from a palm that checked for fray by feel alone. A pilot steps onto a threshold and touches wood with the easy reverence of someone who trusts that wood to carry an entire year's risk and reward. A child, not tired yet, counts aloud in a courtyard the names of winds learned this season, delighted that they taste right in the mouth, as if they were the small spices on the tongue. These are the sounds of a world in which exchange is not spectacle, but practice. The chain of evidence that let this story be told, seeds and shards, cores and inscriptions, genomes of stowaways, isotopes in enamel, was always a means to a calmer end. Small measurements invited us to trade romance for pattern without losing wonder. Clove and cinnamon whispering from pots and mud. Coconut's long wax signatures glossing a stew and a story. Rat and chicken lineages tracing routes the map suggested but could not prove. Harbor layers keeping time with kitchens, repairs, and pilgrim flows. The point was never to triumph over legends, but to give them neighbors, so that a port's myth could sit beside its mud and both could be believed in the right way. There were hesitations we kept in view because honesty is a sleep aid. Crews remain mostly nameless in the record, texts skew to patrons, not to the hands that mended lines by moonlight and tasted the stew for salt before anyone else ate. Burials at entrepôts ask for careful consent if they are to be studied at all. Sacred precincts set boundaries that a responsible curiosity will respect. Ports are living places. Groves shade graves. Recipes sit in families like heirlooms of taste. When knowledge requires cutting, the right answer is sometimes to wait for a gentler method, to learn at the edge rather than at the center, and to give communities the veto that keeps stories humane. If a single image could carry the meaning home, it would be an ordinary peppercorn rolled between forefinger and thumb in a quiet room, the mind's eye seeing at the same time a hillside where vines climbed living poles, and a market lane where a jar of black beads waited by a set of scales, while the wind outside turned a degree toward departure. A small heat, a long route, a reliable schedule. Multiplied by generations, That is how cuisines become archives and how belief becomes place, through patience and repetition and a willingness to adopt and adapt without fuss. This has been Slow Storytelling on Purpose. A channel for sleepy yet curious minds needs breath and cadence more than fanfare. If this companioned a commute, a late shift, a kitchen, a walk, or the last 10 minutes before rest, that is its best possible use. The promise at the beginning, timestamps for easy wandering, still holds. The invitation does too. How and when is this kind of listening most helpful? When worlds are busy, calm is a kind of craft. When facts are many, kindness in tone makes them easier to keep. Why now was not a slogan, but a quiet fact of the last decade. Ancient biomolecules, harbor geoarchaeology, and careful modeling have taken hunches and turned them into maps that bear weight. Yet the map is never the morning. The sea is always the morning. It smells of resin, salt, and smoke. It speaks in intervals. It forgives small errors if they are caught early and penalizes bravado that mistakes patience for weakness. The people in this story, farmers, pickers, pilots, cooks, carpenters, lenders, singers, scribes, lived that lesson and handed it down in work more than in words. We were only visiting. There is a gentle way to close. Picture two coasts at once. On one, a dhow trimmed to perfection, anchored and rocking lightly as the tide reverses. On the other, a stone town's alleys exhaling heat, a cat slipping along a wall, a pot lid lifted just enough to let steam hiss and then set back with a cloth to keep the last minutes private. The same wind touches both, later or sooner. The same plant, coconut or pepper, banana or rice, finds itself at home in both kitchens, seasoned differently and meant to comfort equally. A short prayer rises in one script here, in another there. The meaning is shared even when the words are not. If this series felt like good company, consider leaving a light footprint. Follow, share, whisper it forward to those who like their history steady and their metaphors seaworthy. The best measure of value here is not a number, but a nod on a long drive, a calmer kettle in a late kitchen, a waking with a root still in mind. Curiosity deserves rest as much as work. The monsoon's secret, after all, is not motion alone, but the pause that makes motion possible, the waiting season where neighbors become friends, ideas become habit, and the next crossing becomes less risky because kindness turned into information at a stall over tea. When the winds turn next season, this ocean will be exactly itself again, seasonal, patient, steady enough to trust, surprising enough to respect. Somewhere, a core will be lifted, a spectrum read, a sherd washed, a name traced on a lintel. Somewhere else, a rope will be spliced, a stew finished, a vow kept. That is a good balance, worlds measured and worlds lived, in parallel, without hurry. Dim the lights one last time, loosen the jaw, let breath line up with water. The clock we followed is still running, and it belongs to mornings and to those who make them. Thank you for listening with such even attention. Stay curious, stay calm.